Jack Reeves had been driving for 3 hours through the blizzard, running from memories he couldn't escape, when his headlights caught something that shouldn't be there. Two dark shapes huddled against the white nothing of the mountain road. His foot moved toward the brake, then hesitated. Every instinct from 5 years of isolation screamed at him to keep driving, to stay uninvolved, to protect himself from caring. But Rex, his German shepherd, suddenly stood alert in the passenger seat, ears forward, a low whine building in his throat. The dog's amber eyes locked onto those shapes, then back to Jack, insistent and urgent. This wasn't the casual interest of a dog spotting wildlife. This was focused, deliberate, demanding. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel as he leaned forward, squinting through the wall of snow. Then he saw it, what Rex had already sensed. The shapes weren't random. They were people. An elderly couple, barely visible against the storm, moving with the slow, desperate shuffle of those who know they're dying. That wasn't debris on the roadside. Those were human beings with minutes left to live. Please support us by subscribing to our channel. The cold in the Blue Ridge Mountains was not just a temperature, it was a weapon. It stripped the air of oxygen, turned breath into ice crystals, and transformed every surface into a treacherous trap. The blizzard had swallowed the world whole, reducing visibility to a tunnel of white that stretched no more than 20 feet beyond Jack's headlights. The wind didn't howl. It roared, slamming against his truck with the force of something alive and malicious, determined to push everything off the mountain road. Jack Reeves sat rigid behind the wheel, his body remembering the posture of a soldier even after 5 years of trying to forget. He was 39, but the lines carved into his face told the story of a much older man. His angular features were partially hidden beneath several days of dark stubble, and his steel-gray eyes that had once been trained to spot enemies at impossible distances, now stared at the road with the flat, distant focus of someone who wasn't really seeing anything at all. His black hair, cut short but growing unruly, was streaked with premature gray at the temples. He wore a heavy winter coat, faded jeans, and boots that had walked through too many storms, literal and otherwise. His hands, scarred and calloused, gripped the steering wheel with mechanical precision, the only thing he seemed able to control. Pressed against his right side, sharing the warmth of the truck's struggling heater, was Rex. Rex was a 4-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat that seemed to absorb what little light existed in the storm. He was powerfully built, with intelligent amber eyes that tracked every movement, every shadow beyond the windshield. A small scar ran down his left flank, a memento from their time together in the Middle East, when they'd been part of something larger than themselves. Rex had been Jack's K-9 partner, trained to detect explosives and protect his handler. Now, he was something more essential, the only living connection Jack had to anything resembling purpose. The dog sat alert, ears rotating like radar dishes, his breathing steady but his body tense with the awareness that something was wrong. Jack's eyes were on the road, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, pulled under by the very thing he'd been trying to outrun. The wind battering the truck sounded too much like the rotor wash of a helicopter. The whiteout conditions looked too much like the dust cloud that had risen from the explosion. He wasn't in North Carolina anymore. He was back in the desert 3 years ago, watching the world end in slow motion. He saw Marcus Reed, his best friend, his swim buddy from SEAL training, the brother he'd chosen when the Navy had forged them together in cold water and impossible trials. Marcus with his easy grin and his unshakable belief that they were doing something that mattered. They were supposed to be extracting a high-value target from a compound outside Kandahar. The intelligence had been solid. The plan had been textbook. But intelligence is only as good as the moment it's gathered, and moments change. The explosion, the one that wasn't supposed to be there, the IED they didn't see, had torn through their convoy like the fist of an angry god. Jack had been in the lead vehicle. Marcus had been in the second. Jack had survived with minor injuries, a concussion, and ringing in his ears that lasted for weeks. Marcus had survived long enough to be pulled from the wreckage, long enough for Jack to hold his hand, long enough to look Jack in the eyes and whisper through the blood in his throat, "If you make it out alive, Cole, save something. Don't let the world turn you cold." Then Marcus was gone. But that wasn't the memory that truly destroyed him. The death was a tragedy. Sudden, violent, the kind of loss that special operations soldiers are forced to accept as the price of the mission. The cold anchor that held Jack at the bottom of the dark water was what came after. It was the debriefing, the investigation, the moment when he learned that the intelligence failure had been flagged by 2 different analysts before the mission. The warnings had been overridden by a commanding officer eager to make his mark, to secure a high-profile capture that would advance his career. Marcus hadn't died because war is dangerous. He died because someone had decided his life was an acceptable cost for a promotion. Jack had tried to speak up. He'd filed reports, demanded accountability, pushed for answers. And he'd been met with walls, bureaucratic, political, immovable. The official finding was operational risk inherent to combat operations. No one was held responsible. The officer who'd ignored the warnings received a commendation 6 months later. Jack received a medical discharge for PTSD and was sent home with a handshake and a thank you for your service that tasted like ash. He had lost his faith, not to an enemy bullet, but to the realization that the system he'd devoted his life to valued optics over honor. His marriage had disintegrated within a year. His wife had told him, tears streaming, that she didn't recognize him anymore, that he was already gone even when he was sitting right in front of her. He hadn't argued. She was right. Since then, Jack had been driving. No destination, no plan, just movement. He drove because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant drowning. He told himself he was looking for something, but the truth was darker. He was waiting for the universe to give him a reason to stop running, or a reason to stop altogether. A sharp bark shattered the spiral. Rex had lunged forward, paws on the dashboard, his bark sharp and commanding. The bark he'd used in the field when he detected a threat. Jack snapped back to the present, blinking hard, his heart hammering. The dog's eyes were locked on the windshield, his body vibrating with urgency. "What is it, boy?" Jack's voice was hoarse, rough from disuse. Rex barked again, then turned his head to look directly at Jack, then back to the road. It was a deliberate communication, the kind they'd developed over years of working together. Pay attention. This matters. Jack leaned forward, forcing his eyes to focus through the snow and his own exhaustion. The shapes he'd seen moments before. He'd almost convinced himself they were shadows, tricks of the storm, nothing that required him to act. But now, closer, the headlights illuminated them with brutal clarity. An elderly man and woman, walking together on the side of the road. The man was hunched forward, leaning heavily on the woman, who was barely standing herself. They were moving with the slow, uncoordinated steps of severe hypothermia, the kind of movement that meant their core temperatures had already dropped into the danger zone. Their clothing was inadequate. Thin jackets, no hats, no gloves visible. They looked like ghosts already halfway between this world and the next. Jack's chest tightened. His mind immediately began calculating body mass, exposure time, wind chill, distance to medical care. His SEAL training activated like a reflex, providing data he didn't want. At this temperature, with that level of exposure, they have 15 minutes. Maybe 20 if they're lucky. Probably less. His foot was still hovering over the gas pedal. He could drive past. The storm would erase any evidence that he'd been here. They wouldn't even know he'd seen them. He could keep running, keep the walls up, keep himself safe from the inevitable pain of caring about something and watching it die. Rex barked again, louder this time, and the sound was almost accusatory. Marcus's voice echoed in his head, as clear as if his friend were sitting in the back seat. Don't let the world turn you cold. Jack's jaw clenched. His hands were shaking now. Not from the cold, but from the war happening inside him. The part of him that wanted to survive, to protect himself from any more loss, was screaming at him to drive. But there was another part, buried deep beneath 5 years of scar tissue, that remembered what it felt like to be a man who helped people. A man who stood between danger and the innocent. A man who mattered. "Damn it," Jack whispered. He hit the brakes. The truck slid slightly on the ice before the tires caught traction, and the vehicle shuddered to a stop about 30 yards ahead of the couple. For a long moment, Jack just sat there, hands still on the wheel, staring at the rearview mirror where the two figures continued their agonizing shuffle forward. Rex whined softly, then placed a paw on Jack's arm. The touch was gentle, grounding. The dog's eyes, when Jack met them, held something that looked like faith. "You're right," Jack said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. "You're right." He grabbed his flashlight from the center console, pulled his hood up, and pushed the door open. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving needles of ice into his exposed skin. Rex leaped out beside him, immediately positioning himself at Jack's side, ready to work. Together, man and dog walked back toward the couple, the flashlight beam cutting through the storm. As Jack got closer, he could see their faces more clearly. The man's eyes were glassy and unfocused. The woman's lips were blue, and both were shaking so violently it looked like seizures. They were minutes from collapse, minutes from death. The man looked up as Jack approached, and there was something heartbreaking in his expression. A mixture of hope and shame, gratitude and apology all tangled together. He tried to speak, but his jaw was shaking too hard to form words. Jack stopped in front of them, and for one brief, crystalline moment, he saw them clearly. Not as strangers, not as a burden, not as another potential failure. He saw them as people, as someone's parents, grandparents, maybe, as two human beings who had made a mistake and were about to pay for it with their lives, unless someone chose to act. The choice crystallized in his chest, sharp and clear and undeniable. Jack raised his voice over the wind, firm but not harsh, the tone he'd used 1,000 times when lives were on the line and there was no time for debate. "My name's Jack. I got a truck right there. You're coming with me." The woman's eyes filled with tears that froze on her cheeks. The man tried to protest, pride fighting against desperation, but Jack cut him off. "Sir, with respect, you've got about 10 minutes before your organs start shutting down. This isn't a discussion." He stepped forward, ducking under the man's arm to support his weight.
"Rex, heel."
The dog immediately moved to the woman's other side, pressing against her leg, providing stability and warmth. Jack looked down at her. She was so small, so fragile, and felt something crack open inside his chest, something he'd kept locked away for years. "Can you walk?" he asked her, his voice gentler now. She nodded, barely, and whispered through frozen lips, "Thank you." Jack's throat tightened. He didn't trust himself to respond, so he just nodded and began guiding them toward the truck. Each step was a battle against the wind, against the ice, against the weight of two people who could barely support themselves. But Jack didn't stop. Rex didn't leave the woman's side. And slowly, impossibly, they covered the distance. When they reached the truck, Jack helped the woman into the passenger seat first, then the man beside her. He wrapped them both in the emergency blankets he kept in the back, cranked the heat to maximum, and angled the vents directly at them. Only then did he allow himself to take a breath. Rex jumped into the back seat, immediately positioning himself where he could watch both passengers, his training and instincts making him a silent guardian. Jack slid into the driver's seat, pulled the door closed, and sat for a moment in the sudden, shocking quiet. The storm raged outside, but inside the cab there was only the sound of the heater blowing, the engine idling, and 3 people breathing. The man turned his head slowly, his movements still sluggish from the cold, and looked at Jack with eyes that were starting to clear. "Why?" he managed, his voice a broken rasp. "Why did you stop?" Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He thought of Marcus. He thought of 5 years of running. He thought of all the times he'd driven past people who needed help because he'd convinced himself that he had nothing left to give. He looked at the couple, at their faces, their clasped hands, the way they were holding on to each other even now, and he felt something shift inside him. Not healing, not yet, but maybe the first fragile possibility of it. "Because someone had to," Jack said quietly. Then he put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the road, driving not away from something this time, but toward it. The storm continued to rage, but inside that truck, 3 strangers and 1 loyal dog began a journey that would save more than just 2 lives. It would save them all. Walter Reed had been driving for 47 years, and in all that time, he'd never once gotten truly lost. Oh, he'd taken wrong turns before, everyone did, but there was always a way to correct course, always a friendly gas station attendant or a well-marked sign that pointed him back toward civilization. But today, on this gray afternoon in the Blue Ridge Mountains with snow beginning to dust the windshield of their 2008 Honda Accord, Walter was beginning to suspect that his perfect record was about to end. Beside him, Evelyn hummed softly along with the Christmas music playing on the radio, her small hands folded in her lap, wedding ring catching the weak light filtering through the clouds. At 71, she still had that same gentle presence that had first captivated him at a church social half a century ago. The way she could make any moment feel peaceful, even this one, even as the road narrowed and the snow thickened and Walter's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. "Do you think Sarah will make her cranberry sauce this year?" Evelyn asked, referring to their daughter. "The one with the orange zest?" "I imagine so," Walter said, his voice carrying the steady warmth of someone who'd spent decades answering his wife's questions, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of their conversations. "She knows it's your favorite." 47 years, Evelyn said, reaching over to pat his knee. "Can you believe it? 47 years of your cranberry sauce preferences." Walter smiled despite the growing knot in his stomach. "And 47 years of your terrible jokes." "They're not terrible. They're charming." "They're terrible." But he was smiling, and so was she, and for a moment the afternoon felt like any other. Just two people who'd spent most of their lives together, driving to see their daughter for an early anniversary dinner, trading the same gentle barbs they'd been trading since 1978. Then Walter saw the exit sign flash past, barely visible through the increasing snow, and his heart sank. "Was that our turn?" Evelyn asked, twisting in her seat to look back. "I think so." Walter checked the rearview mirror, but the road behind them had already disappeared into a curtain of white.
I'm sorry, honey.
"The visibility's getting bad. I didn't see it until we were past." "It's all right. We'll just take the next one." But there wasn't a next one. Not for another 20 miles, according to the GPS, a little blue device stuck to the dashboard that Sarah had insisted they take, saying it would be easier than trying to read maps. The GPS was speaking now in its calm, feminine voice, recalculating, offering an alternative route that would take them through what it called Blue Ridge Passage. 15 minutes, the GPS announced cheerfully. "Shortest route to your destination." Walter hesitated, peering ahead at the main highway. Traffic was starting to thin out, other drivers pulling off at rest stops or turning back as the weather worsened. The smart thing would be to do the same. Find a hotel, wait out the storm, arrive tomorrow instead of tonight. But Sarah would worry. She always worried when they were late, and it was just 15 minutes. Surely they could manage 15 minutes. "What do you think?" he asked Evelyn, because after 47 years, he'd learned that the best decisions were the ones they made together. "I think," Evelyn said, squinting at the snow accumulating on the windshield, "that we've driven through worse weather than this. Remember that time in Tennessee? When we could barely see the hood of the car. And we made it just fine," Walter said, feeling his resolve strengthen. They weren't helpless old people who needed to run from a little snow. They were Walter and Evelyn Reed, and they'd weathered harder storms than this, literal and otherwise. He took the turn the GPS indicated, leaving the main highway for a 2-lane road that wound up into the mountains. First, it seemed fine. The pavement was clear enough, the snow just a light dusting that the wipers could handle. Evelyn went back to humming, and Walter relaxed his grip on the wheel. But then the road began to narrow. The smooth asphalt gave way to rougher pavement, cracked and patched, the kind of road that didn't see much maintenance or traffic. Pine trees pressed close on both sides, their branches heavy with snow, creating a tunnel of white and dark green that felt increasingly claustrophobic. The GPS continued its calm directions, continue for 3 miles. But something about the surroundings didn't match the confidence in that artificial voice. "I don't remember this road having so many turns," Evelyn said quietly. Her humming stopped now, her hands no longer relaxed in her lap but gripping each other. Walter didn't answer because he was thinking the same thing. Each curve seemed sharper than the last, the road climbing steadily, and the snow. The snow was no longer a light dusting. It was falling in thick, heavy flakes that the wipers struggled to clear, accumulating on the road faster than seemed possible. He glanced at the GPS. The little blue line showing their route looked increasingly uncertain, flickering at the edges. Then, as they rounded another hairpin turn, the screen went blank. Signal lost. The device announced, its cheerful voice somehow accusatory. Searching for satellites. Walter. Evelyn's voice carried a tremor she was trying to hide. It's okay, he said, though his own heart was hammering now. We'll just turn around. Go back to the highway. But when he looked for a place to turn around, there was nothing. Just the narrow road carved into the mountainside, a rock wall on one side and what looked like a steep drop on the other, though it was hard to tell through the snow. He kept driving, certain that any moment they'd find a wider spot, a driveway, something. The engine made a sound then, a cough, a stutter that Walter felt through the steering wheel more than heard. He pressed the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, then smoothed out. Then it coughed again. Walter, what's wrong with the car? I don't know. But he did know, or at least suspected. The Accord was 12 years old, faithful and reliable, but it wasn't built for this, for steep mountain roads in sub-freezing temperatures with snow coming down like judgment. The engine was straining, working too hard, getting too cold. Maybe we should pull over, Evelyn suggested. Let it rest. Walter nodded, guiding the car to the side of the road, or what he hoped was the side. It was becoming difficult to tell where the road ended and the shoulder began. The moment he put the car in park and took his foot off the gas, the engine died. Complete silence rushed in, broken only by the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal and the whisper of snow against the windshield. Walter turned the key. Nothing. Turned it again. Not even a click. The battery was dead, or the cold had seized something essential, or it didn't matter what had caused it. What mattered was that they were stuck on an abandoned mountain road in a blizzard with no GPS, no working vehicle, and no idea how to get help. Walter pulled out his phone, the screen glowing weakly in the dim interior. No signal. Of course, there was no signal. He tried Evelyn's phone just to be sure, but it showed the same empty bars in the corner. What do we do? Evelyn asked, and there was no panic in her voice, just that same steady trust she'd always had in him. The belief that Walter would figure it out because Walter always figured it out. Except this time, he didn't know. He looked around the car, taking inventory with the methodical calm he'd learned in the army 50 years ago. Half a tank of gas, useless without an engine. One water bottle in the cup holder. Their coats, thin wool things suitable for a mild November day but nowhere near adequate for this cold. In the back seat, a blanket that Evelyn kept for emergencies, but it was decorative, thin. The temperature gauge on the dashboard read 28 degrees outside. Inside the car, without the heater running, it would drop fast. We can't stay here, Walter said slowly, thinking it through. Without heat, we'll freeze. How far back was the highway? Evelyn asked. Maybe 5 miles? 6. Too far. Much too far in this weather. But forward there had to be something. A house, a ranger station, other cars. Anything. I saw lights ahead, just before the car died. I think there might be something up the road. How far? I don't know. A mile? Maybe 2. They looked at each other in the growing darkness, and Walter saw his own fear reflected in his wife's eyes. But he also saw something else, that same stubborn strength that had gotten her through raising 3 children, through his deployment to Vietnam, through her mother's long illness and his father's quick death. Evelyn Reed was scared, but she wasn't defeated. We've walked further than that before, she said, echoing his earlier confidence about the weather, trying to give it back to him. Walter reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were cold already. I'm sorry, he said. This is my fault. I missed the exit. I should have. Stop, Evelyn said firmly, squeezing his hand. We made the decision together. We always do. Now let's make this one together too. They gathered what they could, the thin blanket, which Evelyn wrapped around her shoulders, the water bottle, which Walter put in his pocket. He tried the car door, and it resisted for a moment against the snow piled against it before giving way. The wind that rushed in stole his breath, and the cold was a living thing, vicious and immediate. By the time they'd both climbed out and pushed the doors closed, Walter's hands were already aching. Evelyn's face, framed by the hood of her coat, was pale, her breath coming in visible puffs that the wind snatched away. They started walking, staying close together, Walter keeping himself between Evelyn and the worst of the wind. The road was barely visible now, just a slightly flatter path through the accumulated snow. Each step was a struggle, their feet sinking several inches, the snow trying to pull them down. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, Evelyn stumbled. Walter caught her, felt how violently she was shaking. "I'm okay," she said immediately. "Just slipped." But she wasn't okay. Neither of them was. Walter's fingers were numb despite his gloves, and his knee, the one that had bothered him since a childhood injury, was screaming with every step. The cold was seeping through his coat, through his shirt, working its way toward his core. He looked around desperately for any sign of the lights he thought he'd seen, but there was nothing. Just white, just wind, just the two of them impossibly small against the storm. "I'm sorry," he said again, the words torn from him. "Evelyn, I'm so sorry." "Stop apologizing," she said. But her voice was weaker now, her words slightly slurred. "Just keep walking." They pushed forward, but the snow was erasing their footprints behind them as fast as they made them. As if they'd never been there at all, as if they were already ghosts. Walter's thoughts began to drift in dangerous directions. Thinking about their children, their grandchildren, wondering who would find them, how long it would take. "Walter," Evelyn said, her voice small, "maybe we should rest. Just for a minute."
No.
He heard the sharpness in his voice, forced himself to soften it.
No, honey.
"We have to keep moving." But even as he said it, he felt his own legs weakening, the cold working its way deeper, making everything harder. His mind was starting to feel fuzzy at the edges, thoughts coming slower. He knew what that meant. Hypothermia. They were running out of time. They stumbled to a stop near what might have been a snow bank, both of them breathing hard, shaking uncontrollably. Evelyn leaned against him, and Walter wrapped his arms around her, trying to share what little warmth he had left. The wind howled around them, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the world. "I love you," Evelyn whispered against his chest. 47 years, and I'd do it all again." "I love you too," Walter said, and he meant it with every frozen, failing piece of himself. "Stay with me, just a little further." But they both knew the truth. There was no further. This was as far as they were going to get. This anonymous spot on an anonymous road where the snow would cover them and erase them, and then, impossibly, through the roar of wind and the white static of falling snow, Walter heard something. A low rumble, the deep, mechanical growl of an engine. He lifted his head, squinting into the storm, not daring to hope because hope felt too cruel, too dangerous. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, and then there, cutting through the white nothing, a pair of headlights. "Evelyn," he said, his voice cracking. "Evelyn, there's someone coming." She raised her head, eyes barely focusing, and together they watched those lights approach. Impossible as salvation, real as the cold that was killing them. The truck, because that's what it was, a truck solid and dark and real, slowed, then stopped just ahead of them. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Walter felt a spike of pure terror that whoever was inside would just drive past, would decide they weren't worth the trouble. But then the door opened, and a figure stepped out into the storm, tall, steady, moving with the kind of confidence that Walter recognized from his own military days. The man had a flashlight, and its beam cut through the snow, finding them, fixing them in its circle of light. The stranger walked toward them, and Walter tried to speak, tried to explain, but his jaw was shaking too hard to form words. All he could do was stand there, holding his wife, hoping this ghost or angel or whatever it was would understand. "My name's Jack," the man said, his voice calm and certain, cutting through the chaos. I'm going to get you out of here. And Walter Reed, who had spent 73 years being the one other people leaned on, who had always been the protector, the provider, the one who fixed things, Walter Reed finally let himself lean on someone else. Can you walk? Jack asked. Walter nodded, though he wasn't sure it was true. Then let's go, Jack said. Now. And with his wife's hand in his and a stranger's steady presence beside them, Walter took another step forward, back toward life, back toward warmth, back toward the 48th anniversary they would celebrate together after all. 3 hours earlier, Jack Reeves had been sitting in a truck stop outside of Asheville, staring at a cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking. The waitress, middle-aged, tired eyes, name tag that said Darlene, had refilled it twice without being asked, and each time Jack had nodded his thanks without really seeing her. He was good at that now, at being present without actually being there, at occupying space without taking up any room in the world. The television mounted in the corner was showing weather alerts, a cheerful meteorologist pointing at a swirling mass of white on the radar, warning people to stay home, to avoid unnecessary travel. Jack had watched for a moment, then paid his bill and walked out into the parking lot where the first flakes were just beginning to fall. Unnecessary travel. That was all he did now. Had been doing for 5 years, ever since he'd left the Navy with a medical discharge. A Purple Heart he'd never displayed, and a head full of ghosts that wouldn't stay buried no matter how many miles he put between himself and the places where they'd been born. His truck was a 2015 Ford F-150. Dark blue, nothing fancy, but reliable. In the back were his essentials, a duffel bag with clothes, a sleeping bag, a toolbox, emergency supplies that his SEAL training insisted he carry even though the missions were over. In the cab, almost nothing. No photographs, no mementos, no evidence that Jackson Reeves had ever been anything other than a man who drove from one place to another with no particular destination in mind. Rex was waiting in the passenger seat, head up, amber eyes tracking Jack's approach. The German Shepherd was 4 years old, 65 pounds of muscle and loyalty, and the only living thing that Jack had allowed himself to stay connected to. They'd served together in Afghanistan. Rex trained to detect explosives. Jack trained to go places other people wouldn't and do things other people couldn't. When Jack had gotten out, Rex had come with him, medical retirement for both of them, 2 broken soldiers trying to figure out what life looked like when there was no mission, no purpose, no orders to follow. "Hey, partner," Jack said quietly, sliding into the driver's seat. Rex's tail thumped once against the upholstery, but the dog didn't move from his alert position, didn't relax. He was like Jack that way, always scanning, always watching, never quite able to believe that the world was safe enough to let his guard down. Jack started the engine and pulled out onto the highway, heading north without any real reason except that north was a direction and directions were what kept him moving. The radio was off. It was always off. He'd learned that silence was better than the alternative. Better than music that reminded him of before. Better than news that reminded him of wars still happening without him. Better than talk radio hosts discussing problems he no longer had the energy to care about. The snow was light at first, just a dusting on the windshield that the wipers could handle easily. But as he drove higher into the mountains, it thickened, and the traffic around him began to thin. Other drivers were pulling off, finding hotels, being sensible. Jack kept going. Not because he was brave, but because the storm didn't scare him. Nothing scared him anymore. Not in the way it should. Not in the way that would make him turn back and seek shelter and choose safety over the endless forward motion that had become his only form of existence. He thought about Marcus. He always thought about Marcus when he drove, especially when the weather was bad, especially when the world narrowed down to just him and the road and the space between heartbeats. Marcus Reed, his swim buddy from BUD/S training, his brother in every way that mattered, the man who'd had Jack's back through Hell Week and through every operation afterward, who'd saved his life twice and never asked for anything in return except that Jack do the same. 3 years ago. That's how long it had been since the explosion. The IED that wasn't supposed to be there on a road that Intel had sworn was clear, during an extraction that should have been routine. Jack had been in the lead vehicle. Marcus had been in the second. The blast had been enormous. Jack had felt it more than heard it. A pressure wave that had turned the air solid for a moment before everything became fire and smoke and screaming. Jack had survived with a concussion and some shrapnel wounds. Marcus had survived long enough for Jack to reach him, long enough to hold his hand while the medics worked frantically, long enough to look Jack in the eyes and whisper, "If you make it out alive, Cole, save something. Don't let the world turn you cold." Then Marcus was gone, and Jack was left holding a promise he didn't know how to keep. The investigation had been worse than the death. That's what people didn't understand. That sometimes the killing blow isn't the one that takes your body, but the one that takes your faith. Two intelligence analysts had flagged concerns about that road. They'd noted increased insurgent activity, suspicious patterns, reasons to choose a different route. Their warnings had been overridden by Captain William Hargrove, an officer with political connections and career ambitions, who wanted the high-profile capture and didn't want delays or complications or analysts questioning his judgment. Marcus died because someone decided his life was an acceptable risk for a promotion. Jack had tried to speak up. He'd filed reports, requested meetings, pushed for accountability. He'd been met with walls, bureaucratic, institutional, immovable. The official finding was operational risk inherent to combat operations. No one was disciplined. No one was demoted. 6 months later, Captain Hargrove received a commendation for successful operations in theater. Jack received a medical discharge for PTSD and was told, with what passed for kindness, that he'd done enough, that it was time to go home. But there was no home to go to. His wife Sarah, patient, loving Sarah who'd waited through 3 deployments, had finally run out of patience when he came back the last time. She'd tried. God knows she'd tried. But Jack had been hollowed out, and there was nothing left inside him that knew how to be a husband, a partner, a person who existed for anything other than missions that no longer existed. "You're already gone," she'd said the day she left, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sitting right in front of you and you're already gone." She'd been right. He was gone. The part of him that knew how to live in the world, how to connect, how to care, that had died in the desert with Marcus. What was left was just a ghost operating a body, going through motions without meaning. So he drove. He'd been driving for 5 years now, from one nowhere to another, picking up odd jobs when he needed money, sleeping in the truck when he couldn't afford or didn't want a motel, moving because movement was easier than stillness. In stillness, the memories caught up. In stillness, he had to face what he'd become. A man whose best friend had asked him to save something and who had saved nothing, not even himself. The snow was coming down harder now, the world outside the windshield becoming an abstract painting of white on white. Jack's hands were steady on the wheel, his eyes scanning constantly. Old habits from years of driving through worse conditions in worse places. He noted the other vehicles that had pulled over, hazard lights blinking like distress signals. He noted the way the road was icing over, the places where the pavement disappeared completely under accumulating snow. He noted all of it with the detached competence of someone who'd been trained to operate in chaos. Rex shifted in the passenger seat, a low whine building in his throat. His ears were forward, nose twitching, body going tense in the way it did when he detected something during their missions. Not the relaxed alertness of boredom, but the focused intensity of discovery. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, his voice rough from disuse. He'd barely spoken all day except to order coffee he hadn't drunk. Rex's eyes were locked on something ahead, through the curtain of falling snow. Jack squinted, leaning forward, trying to see what the dog had sensed. At first, there was nothing, just the endless white, the road barely visible, the storm erasing everything. But then, at the edge of his headlights' reach, something moved. 2 shapes, dark against the white. Human-shaped but wrong somehow, too hunched, too slow, moving with the irregular shuffle of people at the end of their endurance. Jack's foot moved toward the brake automatically, then hesitated. His mind was already calculating temperature, exposure time, likely outcomes. Those people were dying, maybe already dead on their feet, just going through the final motions before the cold shut them down completely. If he stopped, if he tried to help, he was taking on responsibility for their survival. And Jack knew better than most how that could end, with more names added to the list of people he couldn't save, more ghosts to drive away from, more proof that caring about anything was just setting yourself up for another failure. "Keep driving," the rational part of his brain said. "Not your problem. You're barely keeping yourself alive." You have nothing to give. But Rex barked. Sharp, insistent. The bark he'd used in the field when he'd found something that mattered. Something that couldn't be ignored. The dog turned to look at Jack, and there was something almost accusatory in those amber eyes, as if Rex could see right through him to the man he used to be. The man who would never have hesitated. The man Marcus had believed in. Marcus. God, Marcus would have stopped without even thinking about it. Marcus who'd believed that every life mattered, that every person was worth the risk. Marcus who'd made Jack promise not to let the world turn him cold. Jack's hands were shaking now. Not from cold but from something deeper. Something he'd been trying not to feel for 5 years. Fear. Not of the storm or the risk or even failure. Fear of caring again. Fear of trying again. Fear of letting another person matter enough to hurt him when he inevitably failed to save them. I can't, he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Rex or Marcus or himself. I couldn't save him. What makes you think I can save them? Rex barked again, sharp and urgent, and Jack saw the shapes stumble, one catching the other, both of them barely staying upright. 15 minutes, maybe 20, and they'd be dead. Their families would come looking eventually, would find them frozen by the roadside, would spend the rest of their lives wondering if someone had driven past, if someone had seen them and chosen not to stop. Marcus's voice echoed in his head, as clear as if his friend were sitting in the back seat. Don't let the world turn you cold, brother. Jack hit the brakes. The truck slid slightly on the ice before the tires caught traction, and the vehicle shuddered to a stop about 30 yards ahead of the shapes. For a long moment, Jack just sat there, engine idling, wipers working, staring at the rearview mirror where the two figures continued their agonizing shuffle through the storm. His chest was tight, his breathing shallow, his whole body tensed for flight. Every instinct screamed at him to put the truck in gear and keep going, to protect himself from the pain of caring, from the risk of failing, from the weight of responsibility he'd sworn he'd never carry again. But Rex was looking at him with those steady amber eyes, and somewhere in Jack's hollowed-out chest, something that had been dead for 5 years was trying to wake up. It hurt. God. It hurt worse than the shrapnel wounds, worse than the concussion, worse than anything physical he'd ever endured. But it was also the first time in 5 years that he'd felt anything other than numbness. Damn it, Jack said, his voice breaking on the words. He grabbed his flashlight from the center console, pulled his hood up, and pushed the door open. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, driving needles of ice into his exposed skin. Rex leaped out beside him, immediately positioning himself at Jack's side. Ready to work, ready to help, ready to be the partner he'd always been. Together, they walked back toward the shapes, the flashlight beam cutting through the storm. With each step, Jack could see more clearly what he was walking toward. An elderly man and woman, holding each other up, their faces pale and slack with hypothermia, their movements increasingly uncoordinated. His training kicked in automatically. Severe hypothermia, organ shutdown imminent, minutes remaining at best. They looked up as he approached, and Jack saw the moment of recognition in their eyes. Not recognition of him specifically, but recognition of what he represented. Hope, rescue, the possibility that this wasn't how their story ended. The man tried to speak, but his jaw was shaking too hard to form words. The woman just stared, tears freezing on her cheeks, her body trembling so violently it looked like seizures. Jack stopped in front of them, and for one crystalline moment, he saw them clearly. Not as a mission, not as a responsibility, not as another potential failure. He saw them as people, as someone's parents, grandparents maybe, as two human beings who'd made a mistake and were about to pay for it with their lives unless someone chose to act. The weight of Marcus's last words settled over him like a mantle. Save something. Maybe he couldn't save everyone. Maybe he couldn't save Marcus or his marriage or himself. But he could save these two people standing in front of him right now. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what Marcus had been trying to tell him. That you don't have to save the whole world, you just have to save what's right in front of you. My name's Jack, he said, his voice steady now, certain in a way it hadn't been in years. I'm going to get you out of here. And with that simple declaration, Jack Reeves took the first step back toward being the man he used to be. Not a ghost, not a failure, not someone broken beyond repair. Just a man with a truck and a dog and a promise to keep, choosing to stop when everyone else drove past. Jack's assessment was automatic, clinical, the result of years of training that had never really left him. The woman, maybe 5'2", couldn't weigh more than 110 pounds, was in worse shape. Her lips had gone from pink to blue to an alarming purple-gray, and her eyes weren't quite focusing. Stage 3 hypothermia, maybe stage 4. Core temperature probably somewhere around 90 degrees and dropping. Without intervention, she had maybe 10 minutes before her major organs started shutting down. Maybe less. The man was slightly better off, but not by much. He was older, 70s probably, and the cold had turned his weathered face into a map of broken capillaries and ice-pale skin. He was shaking so violently that it looked painful, his whole body convulsing with the effort of trying to generate heat that wasn't there anymore. But his eyes were clearer than hers, more aware, and when they met Jack's, there was something in them that twisted in Jack's chest. Not fear, but apology. "Sir, can you hear me?" Jack raised his voice over the wind, keeping his tone firm but not harsh. Command presence, they called it in the teams, the ability to project calm certainty even when everything was chaos. The man nodded, tried to speak, but his jaw was shaking too hard to form words. He gestured toward the woman, a protective movement even in extremis, trying to communicate that she needed help first, that she was more important, that even dying he was thinking about someone else. "I see her," Jack said. "I've got you both, but I need you to stay with me. Okay? Can you do that?" Another nod, and Jack saw the military bearing in it. The straightness of the spine despite the cold, the determination not to fall apart, the old soldier's refusal to be a burden. Jack recognized it because he'd worn that same mask himself for years, had learned in boot camp and SEAL training that you didn't complain, didn't quit, didn't show weakness no matter what your body was doing. "What's your name, sir?"
Walter.
The word came out in pieces, shattered by tremors.
Walter Errit.
"Okay, Walter. I'm Jack. This is Rex." The German shepherd had positioned himself next to the woman. His body heat a small but significant contribution. His presence calm and steady. "We're going to get you both to my truck. It's warm, got blankets, and it's about 30 yards that way." He pointed with the flashlight. "Think you can make it? We don't want to be T-trouble." Walter's pride was still fighting, even as his body was giving up. "We can wait for. Sir, with respect, you're past the point of choice." Jack's voice was gentle but absolute. "Your wife is in stage 3 hypothermia. She's got minutes, not hours. You're not far behind. Now, I can carry her and you can walk beside me, or I can carry both of you one at a time. Either way, we're going. The only question is how fast." Walter's face crumpled for a moment, the facade of control finally breaking. "I'm sorry. This is my fault. I missed the exit. The storm is the enemy." Jack cut in, because he recognized that spiral, the guilt and self-blame that could paralyze you when action was the only thing that mattered. "Not you, not her, just the cold. And we're going to beat it, but we need to move now." He turned to the woman without waiting for further argument. "Ma'am, my name is Jack. I'm going to pick you up now. Is that okay?" She didn't respond, just stared at him with glassy eyes, and Jack made the decision for her. He'd done carries like this before, casualties in the field, injured teammates, civilians caught in crossfire. His back wasn't what it used to be. His knee still ached sometimes from an old injury, but muscle memory was a powerful thing. He bent, got one arm under her knees and the other around her back, and lifted. She weighed almost nothing, 90 pounds soaking wet, and most of that was probably the winter coat. He could feel how cold she was even through the layers, could feel the violent trembling that had seized her body. She made a small sound, something between a whimper and a sigh, and her head lolled against his shoulder. "Stay with me," he murmured, adjusting his grip. "You're safe now. I've got you." Walter tried to stand straighter, tried to look capable, but his legs gave out halfway through the motion and he pitched forward. Jack couldn't catch him. His arms were full, But Rex was there instantly, pressing against Walter's side, providing a solid anchor. The old man grabbed the dog's harness with both hands, steadying himself, and something in his face shifted when he felt that thick fur, that warm, solid presence. "Good boy," Jack said to Rex, who looked up at him with those amber eyes that seemed to understand everything. "Stay with him. Help him walk." They started moving, Jack in the lead carrying Evelyn, Walter following with one hand on Rex's harness, the dog matching his pace perfectly. The 30 yards to the truck felt like 30 miles. The wind fought them every step, trying to push them over, trying to steal the precious body heat they had left. The snow was knee-deep in places, and Jack's boots kept breaking through the crust, forcing him to pull his legs free with each step. Evelyn's breathing was shallow against his neck, too slow, too weak, and Jack found himself talking to her, keeping up a steady stream of words that was as much for him as for her. "Almost there. You're doing great. Just a little further. Your husband's right behind us. He's strong. He's going to make it. You're both going to make it. I've got you. I won't let go." Walter fell once, his legs finally giving out completely, and Jack heard the sound even over the wind, the heavy thump of a body hitting snow-covered ground. He spun around, heart in his throat, but Rex was already there, whining, nosing at Walter's face. The old man was trying to get up, failing, his arms too weak to push himself off the ground. "Stay down and you die," Jack said, harsh now because sometimes harsh was what people needed. "Get up, Walter. Your wife needs you. Get up." And Walter did. Somehow, impossibly, the old man got his hands under him, got his knees under him, used Rex's solid body to lever himself upright. His face was a mask of determination and pain, but he was standing, and he took another step forward. "That's it," Jack said, his voice softer now. "That's a soldier. Keep moving." The truck appeared out of the storm like salvation, dark and solid and real. Jack reached it first, managed to get the passenger door open with one hand while holding Evelyn with the other. The interior light came on, spilling warm yellow illumination into the frozen dark, and Jack heard Walter make a sound behind him. Half sob, half laugh, pure relief. Jack set Evelyn on the seat as gently as he could, then reached into the back for the emergency blankets he kept there. Silver mylar, designed to reflect body heat. He wrapped her in 2 of them, then cranked the heat to maximum and angled all the vents toward her. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing barely visible, and Jack put his fingers against her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak, thready, but there. Walter reached the truck, Rex still supporting him, and Jack helped him into the passenger seat beside his wife. The old man immediately reached for her, taking her hand, and Jack saw his lips moving, prayer or reassurance or just her name, repeated like a mantra. Jack wrapped another blanket around Walter's shoulders, then grabbed a 4th and draped it over both of them. "Rex, up." The dog jumped into the back seat without hesitation, settling into his usual spot, his body heat another weapon against the cold. Jack climbed into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut, and the sudden absence of wind was almost shocking. For a moment, nobody spoke. There was just the sound of the heater running, the engine idling, 3 people breathing. One too fast, one too slow, one trying to stay steady enough to keep the other 2 alive. Jack checked the rearview mirror, saw Walter staring at him with tears freezing on his cheeks, saw Evelyn still unconscious between them, saw Rex alert and watchful in the back. Then he put the truck in gear and began the careful process of turning around on the narrow, icy road. "I'm taking you to Grayson," he said, his voice cutting through the mechanical sounds. "Closest town with medical facilities. About 35 miles. How long?" Walter's voice was stronger now, warming up literally and figuratively. "In this weather? An hour. Maybe more." Jack didn't sugarcoat it. They needed to know what they were in for. "You need to keep talking to her. Don't let her sleep yet. Her body needs to warm up slowly, not fast. Fast can cause cardiac arrest." Walter nodded, understanding, and turned back to his wife. "Evelyn," he said, his voice cracking. "Honey, wake up. Come on, sweetheart. Stay with me." Jack drove with the kind of focused intensity he'd learned in hostile territories, where one mistake meant death and awareness meant survival. The road was barely visible, the storm still raging, but his hands were steady on the wheel, his mind calculating traction and momentum and risk with every turn. They'd been driving for maybe 5 minutes when Walter spoke again. His voice quieter now but clearer. "Why did you stop?" Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel. It was a simple question with a complicated answer. One that involved Marcus and guilt and 5 years of running and a dog who'd refused to let him keep driving past people who needed help. But Walter didn't need the complicated version. Maybe Jack didn't either. "Because someone had to," he said simply. In the rearview mirror, he saw Walter's face crumple. Saw the old man bow his head, shoulders shaking with something that might have been sobs or might have been the residual tremors of hypothermia. Evelyn stirred slightly, made a small sound, and Walter was immediately there, squeezing her hand, whispering to her. Jack drove on through the storm, and for the first time in 5 years he wasn't running from something. He was running toward it, toward warmth, toward safety, toward the possibility that maybe saving one thing could start to redeem all the things he hadn't saved. The wooden dashboard of his truck had never felt more solid under his hands. Rex had never been more alert in the back seat, and the 2 strangers in his passenger seat had never felt less like strangers. "Thank you," Walter whispered. So quiet Jack almost didn't hear it over the wind and the engine. Jack nodded, not trusting his voice, and focused on the road ahead. They weren't safe yet. They had 30 more miles of ice and snow and mechanical uncertainty between them and survival. But they were moving, they were together, and for the first time since Marcus died, Jack felt like maybe, just maybe, he was doing what he was supposed to be doing. Rex shifted in the back seat, let out a soft sigh, and settled his head on his paws. The dog's amber eyes reflected in the rearview mirror, and Jack could have sworn there was approval in them. As if Rex knew that his human had finally remembered how to be human again. The storm raged on outside, but inside that truck, 3 people and 1 loyal dog had found a fragile, precious warmth that had nothing to do with the heater and everything to do with the choice to stop, to care, to try. It wasn't redemption yet. Redemption would take more than one good act. But it was a start. And sometimes, Jack thought as he navigated another treacherous curve, sometimes a start is all you need. For the first 10 miles, Jack allowed himself to believe they might actually make it. The truck was handling well enough, the tires gripping where they needed to, the engine running strong and steady. Walter's shaking had subsided from violent convulsions to manageable tremors, and color was slowly returning to his weathered face. Even Evelyn had shown signs of improvement. Her breathing had deepened, become more regular, though she still hadn't opened her eyes or spoken. Jack kept his speed low, maybe 20 miles per hour, reading the road through a combination of what he could actually see and what years of driving in hostile conditions had taught him to sense. The white line that marked the edge of the pavement was barely visible beneath the snow, but he could feel the slight difference in resistance when the tires started to drift onto the shoulder. It was like navigating by feel in the dark, pure instinct backed by training. Walter had been talking to Evelyn almost continuously, his voice growing stronger with each passing minute. He told her about their daughter Sarah, about the grandchildren waiting for them, about the anniversary dinner they were going to have. The words were both comfort and command. "Stay with me. Remember why you're fighting. Don't let go." Jack listened with half his attention, the rest focused on keeping them alive through the next curve, the next half mile, the next moment. Then the road began to climb. Jack felt it before he saw it. The way the engine's pitch changed, working harder, the way the truck's momentum shifted. The grade wasn't steep at first, just a gradual incline, but combined with the ice and the weight of the vehicle, it was enough to make the tires slip occasionally, searching for traction that wasn't always there. "We're going up the mountain pass," Jack said, more to himself than his passengers. But Walter heard and looked up sharply. "Is that bad?" "It's not good." Jack downshifted, felt the transmission grab and hold. "But we can handle it. Just need to keep moving. If we stop on this incline, we might not get started again." He didn't add that stopping could also mean sliding backward, that the ice was getting thicker as they climbed, that every foot of elevation made the temperature drop and the conditions worse. Walter was smart enough to figure that out on his own, and Evelyn didn't need to hear it. The truck fishtailed once. the rear end sliding sideways before Jack corrected with a gentle turn of the wheel and a slight acceleration. His hands were light on the controls, remembering the lessons learned driving in Afghan mountain passes where one wrong move meant a 100-foot drop. This wasn't that different, just colder, whiter, lonelier. They crested the first rise and the road flattened briefly before climbing again. Through a gap in the storm, Jack caught a glimpse of what lay ahead. More curves, steeper grades, and in the distance, barely visible through the snow, the dark shapes of abandoned vehicles. "There are cars ahead," Walter said, spotting them too. "Should we stop? Check if anyone needs help." Jack's instinct was to say yes, the old instinct, the one that had made him a SEAL, that had made him the kind of person who ran toward danger instead of away from it. But he looked at Evelyn, still unconscious, at the fuel gauge that had dropped farther than he'd expected, at the storm that showed no signs of letting up. "No engines running," he said, scanning the vehicles as they passed. Doors open, footprints leading away. They got out, probably got picked up already. He hoped that was true. He hoped he wasn't making the same choice others had made with Walter and Evelyn. Driving past because stopping was too risky, too complicated, too much. But he also knew that he couldn't save everyone. He'd learned that lesson in the desert, learned it again every day for the past 5 years. Sometimes you had to choose the people in front of you or the people who might be somewhere else. And right now, the people in front of him were his responsibility. The fuel gauge caught his attention again, and Jack did a quick calculation in his head. 35 miles total. They'd covered maybe 12, which left 23. Half a tank of gas. But cold weather meant the engine was working harder, burning fuel faster. And if they hit any serious obstacles, if they had to detour or backtrack, he pushed the thought away. Worry about what was in front of him, not what might happen 3 miles down the road. That was another SEAL lesson. Break the impossible mission into manageable pieces. Handle each piece as it comes. Don't let the big picture paralyze you. They were rounding another curve when Evelyn suddenly convulsed. Her whole body went rigid, back arching, hands clutching at nothing, and a sound came from her throat that was somewhere between a gasp and a scream. Walter grabbed her, panic flooding his face, and Jack's heart rate spiked even as his training kicked in. "What's happening?" Walter's voice cracked. Evelyn, talk to me." "It's okay," Jack said, forcing calm into his voice even though his mind was racing through possibilities. Cardiac arrest, stroke, organ failure. "It's painful, but it's normal. Her body's warming up too fast. The blood vessels are dilating, sending cold blood from her extremities back to her core." He kept driving, couldn't stop, couldn't pull over, but he reached back with one hand while keeping his eyes on the road. "Walter, listen to me. Rub her arms. Gently. Just circulation. Don't squeeze hard, just keep the blood moving. Talk to her. Let her know you're there." Walter obeyed, his hands shaking as he rubbed Evelyn's arms through the blanket, whispering to her. The convulsion passed after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. Evelyn went limp, breathing hard, and then, impossibly wonderfully, her eyes fluttered open. "Walter." Her voice was barely a whisper, confused and weak. "I'm here, honey. I'm right here." Walter was crying now, tears streaming down his face. "You're safe. We're in a truck. This man, Jack, he saved us." Evelyn's eyes found Jack in the rearview mirror, unfocused but aware, and Jack saw the moment she understood. That they'd been dying, that this stranger had stopped, that they were still alive because someone had chosen to care. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack's throat was too tight to respond, so he just nodded and focused on the road, which was getting harder to see as the storm intensified. The wind had picked up, not just blowing snow but driving it horizontally, turning the windshield into a wall of white static. His speed dropped to 15 miles per hour, then 10, the truck crawling forward because forward was the only option. "Do you have family?" Evelyn asked after a few minutes, her voice stronger but still soft. "Someone waiting for you?" Jack's hands tightened on the wheel. "Had a wife. Didn't work out. Children?"
No.
"Just me. And Rex." But the dog wasn't just a pet, he was a partner, a reminder of who Jack used to be. "That's lonely," Evelyn said simply, and something about the straightforward compassion in her voice cracked something open in Jack's chest. "I'm used to it," he said, but even as the words came out, he realized they might not be true anymore. Sitting here with these two strangers, responsible for their lives, connected by circumstances and choice, this didn't feel lonely. It felt like the opposite of lonely, even if he didn't have a word for what that opposite was. Walter shifted, adjusting the blanket around his wife, and then spoke quietly. "We almost didn't make it once before. Long time ago, when Evelyn was pregnant with our first. I was out hunting, got turned around, spent 3 days in the woods before I found my way back." 3 days, Evelyn added, a hint of her personality returning. 3 days I waited, not knowing if he was dead or alive. "When I got back," she said, "don't ever leave me wondering again." Walter's voice was thick with memory. "And here I am, making her wonder anyway." "She's not wondering," Jack said, and meant it. "She's right here. You both are." The conversation died as the road demanded all of Jack's attention. They were approaching a sharp curve when Jack saw it. A jackknifed semi-truck blocking both lanes, its trailer at a 45-degree angle to the cab, completely impassable. Jack hit the brakes carefully, felt the truck slide before the tires caught. They stopped 20 feet from the wreckage, engine idling, wipers working futilely against the accumulating snow. "What now?" Walter asked, and Jack heard the fear creeping back into his voice. Jack was already scanning the area, looking for options. To the right, a steep drop into darkness. To the left, what looked like a service road, barely more than a dirt track, unpaved, definitely not maintained in winter. It was steep, narrow, and might not even connect back to the main road. But it was the only option. "We take a detour," Jack said, putting the truck in four-wheel drive. The service road was worse than he'd expected. The moment the tires left the pavement, the truck began to struggle. Snow was deeper here, no other vehicles to pack it down, and the incline was brutal. Jack felt the wheels spin, catch, spin again. The engine roared, transmission whining, the whole vehicle shuddering with effort. In the back seat, Rex braced himself, sensing the instability. Walter had gone silent, both arms wrapped around Evelyn, holding her tight. Jack kept his foot steady on the gas. Not too much or they'd just dig themselves in deeper, not too little or they'd lose momentum and slide backward. For a long, terrible moment, Jack thought they weren't going to make it. The wheels were spinning more than gripping, the truck moving forward in inches when it needed to move in feet. His mind was already calculating alternatives. Backing down, trying to winch around the semi somehow, abandoning the truck and walking. Then the tires caught something solid beneath the snow. The truck lurched forward, climbed 3 feet, 5, 10. The service road crested a small hill and suddenly they were back on pavement, the main road appearing through the storm like a gift. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were aching from gripping the wheel so hard, his shoulders tight with tension. In the rearview mirror, he saw Walter's white-knuckled grip on the dashboard, saw Evelyn's wide eyes. "Everyone okay?" Jack asked. "Define okay," Walter said, but there was a ghost of humor in his voice, and Jack found himself almost smiling. They'd gone maybe another mile when the temperature warning light came on. Jack saw it immediately, the little red icon on the dashboard, innocent and terrifying. The engine was overheating, probably snow packed into the radiator from that brutal climb, blocking airflow. If he kept driving, the engine would seize. If he stopped here, they were sitting ducks in a storm with no help coming. "We need to stop," he said. "Engine problem. 2-minute fix. But I have to do it now." He pulled to the side of the road, or what he hoped was the side, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. Jack grabbed his flashlight and opened the door, immediately hit by wind that felt like it had teeth. "Stay here," he said, and pushed out into the storm. He popped the hood and began clearing snow from around the radiator, his hands already going numb despite his gloves. It was worse than he'd thought. Pack solid, turned to ice in places. He needed something to pry with, to chip away at. The passenger door opened, and Walter stumbled out. Get back in the truck, Jack shouted over the wind. You saved us? Walter shouted back, making his way around the front of the truck. I'm not useless. And despite everything, the cold, the danger, the absurdity of this 73-year-old man who'd been hypothermic 20 minutes ago now insisting on helping, Jack felt something like gratitude, maybe even respect. Together they worked, Walter using his pocket knife to chip at the ice, while Jack scooped away the loosened snow. It took longer than 2 minutes, more like 5, and by the time they finished, both men were shaking violently. But when Jack started the engine again, the temperature gauge stayed in the safe zone. They climbed back into the truck, both men gasping, both soaked and frozen, and Evelyn had tears in her eyes as she wrapped the blanket around her husband. You two are going to give me a heart attack, she said. Fair's fair, Walter managed through chattering teeth. You gave me one first, and despite everything, despite the storm and the danger and the miles still ahead of them, Jack laughed. It was a rusty sound, unpracticed, but it was real. And in that moment, with 3 miles of hell behind them and an unknown number ahead, Jack realized that Walter and Evelyn Reed weren't strangers anymore. He didn't know when the shift had happened, but somewhere between picking them up and fixing that engine together, they'd become something else. They'd become his. The lights of Grayson appeared through the storm like a mirage, distant, flickering, almost too perfect to be real. Jack saw them first, a faint glow on the horizon that could have been wishful thinking or the beginning of hallucinations from exhaustion. But then Walter saw them too, and made a sound that was part laugh, part sob. Is that town? Jack confirmed, allowing himself the smallest measure of relief. 3 miles, maybe 4. They were going to make it. Then the lights went out. Not gradually, not one by one, but all at once. A complete blackout that swallowed the distant glow and left only darkness and snow. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel as he processed what had just happened. The storm had taken out the power grid. Grayson was dark. What does that mean? Evelyn asked quietly, and Jack heard the fear creeping back into her voice. The fear that had briefly receded when they thought safety was close. It means the hospital might not have power, Jack said, keeping his voice steady. But hospitals have backup generators. Fire stations do too. We find one of those, we're fine. He didn't mention that finding anything in a blacked-out town during a blizzard would be like navigating by braille. Didn't mention that every emergency service building would likely be overwhelmed with people seeking shelter. Didn't mention that the fuel gauge was now firmly in the red zone, the needle hovering just above empty. They drove into Grayson 2 miles later, and the town looked like something from an apocalypse movie. Every building dark, every street empty. Snow accumulating on abandoned cars and closed storefronts. The only sound was their engine and the wind, the only movement their headlights cutting through the white. It was eerie, unsettling, like they'd driven into a ghost town. Jack navigated slowly down Main Street, scanning for any sign of life, any indication of where people might have gathered. Hospital would be on the far side of town, probably a mile away. Fire station should be closer, but he didn't know where. The GPS had died hours ago, and the storm had erased any helpful landmarks. There, Walter said suddenly, pointing. That blue sign says, Emergency Services with an arrow. Jack followed the sign, turned left onto a side street, and that's when the engine coughed. It was the same sound from earlier, when Walter and Evelyn's car had given up. A stutter, a loss of power, the mechanical equivalent of a death rattle. Jack's stomach dropped as the truck lurched forward, smoothed out for a few yards, then coughed again. Come on, he muttered, more prayer than command. Come on, just a little farther. The truck rolled forward another 100 yards, the engine sputtering, fighting, trying. Jack could see a building ahead, brick, 2 stories. Emergency lights barely visible through the snow. Could be the fire station. Could be their salvation. Just had to make it. The engine died. The truck coasted for a moment on momentum alone, rolling silently through the snow, before coming to rest in the middle of the empty street. Jack turned the key. Nothing. Turned it again. Not even a click. They'd run completely out of fuel, and they were still 300 yards from the building. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the wind and the steady tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine, a sound that felt like a countdown to something inevitable and bad. "How far?" Walter asked finally. Jack looked at the building through the falling snow, did the calculation. "Quarter mile. Maybe less. Evelyn can't walk that far." Walter's voice was flat, stating fact, not complaint. Jack turned to look at them both. Evelyn was conscious but weak, her face pale, her body still wrapped in the emergency blankets. She'd made progress, was no longer in immediate danger of organ failure, but she was far from recovered. Walking a quarter mile in this storm would undo everything they'd accomplished. Might kill her. "I'll carry her," Jack said simply. "You can't carry her that far." Walter wasn't arguing, just being realistic. "Not in this wind, not through this snow." "I can," Jack said, and there was no bravado in it, just certainty. He'd carried heavier loads farther in worse conditions. It would hurt, it would cost him, but he could do it. Question is, can you walk on your own? Walter looked down at his hands, flexed his fingers, assessed his own condition with the same brutal honesty he'd been applying to Evelyn's. "Yes," he said finally. "I can walk." "Then let's move." Jack got out first, Rex following immediately, and together they helped Evelyn out of the truck. She tried to stand, made it halfway before her legs gave out, and Jack caught her before she hit the ground. She weighed nothing, maybe 90 pounds soaking wet, but the wind was another matter entirely. The moment Jack lifted her, the storm tried to push them both over, and he had to brace himself, adjust his stance, fight for every inch of stability. Walter came around the truck, using Rex as support, the old man and the dog moving together with surprising coordination. Jack wrapped Evelyn in the blanket like a cocoon, adjusted his grip so she was secure against his chest, and started walking. The first 100 yards were manageable. The adrenaline was still high, his muscles still fresh, and the fire station was visible ahead. A goal, something to move toward. Walter kept pace beside him, one hand on Rex's harness, the other clutching his coat closed against the wind. Evelyn's head rested against Jack's shoulder, her breath warm against his neck, and he kept talking to her, keeping her conscious, keeping her engaged. "Almost there. You're doing great. Just stay with me. Walter's right here. We're all going to make it." The second 100 yards were harder. Jack's arms were starting to burn, the weight that had felt insignificant now feeling like lead. His legs were fighting through snow that was sometimes ankle-deep, sometimes knee-deep, never consistent, always treacherous. Behind him, he could hear Walter's labored breathing, the old man's steps getting slower, less certain. "You okay back there?" Jack called over his shoulder. "Fine," Walter gasped, but he wasn't fine. None of them were fine. They were all running on fumes and willpower. Halfway through the third 100 yards, Walter fell. Jack heard the heavy thump, heard Rex's sharp bark, and turned to see the old man on his hands and knees in the snow, trying to get up and failing. Jack stood there, holding Evelyn, calculating distances and endurance and impossible choices. "Go!" Walter shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Take her. Save her. Leave me." Jack had heard those words before. In the desert, from wounded teammates who knew they were slowing the squad down, who made the calculation that one life wasn't worth risking 5. He'd had to make those calls, had to leave people behind when the mission demanded it, and every one of those faces haunted him still. Not this time. "Rex, guard," Jack commanded, and the dog immediately positioned himself next to Walter, a warm, solid presence. Then Jack carefully set Evelyn down, leaning her against a snow bank, and went back for Walter. "What are you doing?" Walter protested as Jack hauled him to his feet. "You can't. I'll slow you down. We all make it or none of us do," Jack said, and there was steel in his voice now, the command presence that had led men through firefights and impossible odds. "That's not negotiable. Now walk." He got his arm under Walter's shoulders, supporting half his weight, and together they made their way back to Evelyn. Jack lifted her again, his arms screaming in protest, and Walter fell into step beside him, using both Jack and Rex for support. They moved as a unit now, man, woman, man, dog, struggling forward through the storm. The fire station was so close Jack could see details now. The garage door, the small side entrance, a faint glow that might be emergency lighting. 100 yards. 75. 50. Jack's legs were shaking, his arms numb. Every step a negotiation between will and failing flesh. Beside him, Walter was making sounds of effort with each step, little grunts of pain and determination. Evelyn had gone still in Jack's arms, and he couldn't tell if she'd lost consciousness or was just conserving energy. 25 yards from the door, Jack's left knee, the one that had bothered him since an old parachute landing gone wrong, finally gave out. He didn't fall completely, just dropped to one knee, Evelyn still cradled against his chest. But he stayed there, kneeling in the snow, his body refusing to stand, his muscles simply done. Jack! Walter's voice, sharp with panic. Jack knelt there, breathing hard, staring at the door that was so close and might as well have been a mile away. He'd failed. After everything, after all the driving and the fighting and the promises, he'd failed 25 yards from salvation. Marcus had been right, he couldn't save everyone. Hell, he couldn't even save 2 old people and himself. Then he heard it. Not out loud, but in his head, clear as if his friend were standing beside him. Not this time, brother. Get up. Marcus. Always Marcus. The voice that had pushed him through Hell Week, through missions when giving up would have been easier, through every impossible moment. The voice that had made him stop for these 2 people in the first place. I can't, Jack whispered. Yes, you can, Marcus's voice insisted. Because if you don't, they die. And you know what that feels like. You won't survive another one. So get up. Jack's arms were shaking so violently now that he was afraid he'd drop Evelyn. His legs felt like they were made of water. But Marcus was right, he'd been right 3 years ago, and he was right now. Jack couldn't survive another failure, another name added to his list of people he couldn't save. So he stood. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harder than Hell Week. Harder than any combat operation. Harder than living with Marcus's death. His muscles screamed. His knee buckled again. But Walter was there, supporting him, and somehow Jack stayed upright. 25 yards, Walter gasped. And Jack realized the old man was counting down for both of them. 20. 15. They walked together, holding each other up, Rex leading the way like a guide through the underworld. 10 yards. 5. The door was right there, brick and metal and the promise of warmth. Jack shifted Evelyn to one arm, raised his other hand, and pounded on the door with his fist. Once, twice, 3 times. The door opened, and warmth rushed out, and faces appeared. Firefighters in uniform, concerned and confused and already reaching for them. Jesus Christ! Get them inside! Hands took Evelyn from Jack's arms, and the sudden absence of her weight made him stumble. More hands caught him, caught Walter, guided them both through the door into light and heat. Jack's legs finally gave out completely, and he slid down the wall to sit on the floor, back against brick, breathing in great heaving gasps. Someone was asking questions. Who are you? Where did you come from? What happened? But Jack couldn't answer. Across the room, he could see medics working on Evelyn and Walter, checking vitals, wrapping them in heated blankets. They were alive. They were safe. He'd gotten them here. You brought them through that storm? A voice, the fire chief, probably older guy with authority in his tone. Jack nodded, still couldn't speak. You're a hell of a driver, son. Not a driver, Jack finally managed, his voice rough and broken. Just someone who stopped. Rex pressed against his side, warm and solid, and Jack wrapped an arm around the dog, holding on to the only constant in his life. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Evelyn's voice, weak but clear. Is he okay? Is Jack okay? And for the first time in 5 years, Jack felt something other than numbness or pain. He felt connected, part of something larger than his own failure and guilt. These 2 strangers, not strangers anymore, cared whether he was okay. Had made it through hell and their first thought was for him. Maybe Marcus had been right. Maybe you didn't save the world. Maybe you just saved what was right in front of you. And maybe, in doing that, you saved yourself too. The fire station had become a temporary emergency shelter, its garage filled with a dozen stranded people. Families who'd abandoned cars, workers caught between shifts, travelers who'd been smarter than Jack and pulled off the road before it was too late. The space smelled of wet wool and coffee, of diesel from the fire engines and the sharp medicinal scent of the first aid supplies that had been broken out. A portable generator hummed in the background, providing just enough power for lights and heat, and someone had set up a coffee station on a folding table near the back wall. Jack sat against that wall now, a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hands, watching as two paramedics worked on Walter and Evelyn. They'd been moved to a clear area near the trucks, wrapped in heated blankets, hooked up to portable monitors that beeped reassuringly. Evelyn's color was better. The blue had faded from her lips, replaced by a healthy pink that made Jack's chest unclench slightly. Walter was sitting up now, arguing with a paramedic about whether he really needed an 4. Sir, you're dehydrated and hypothermic. This isn't optional. I'm fine. Check on my wife. Your wife is stable. You're my patient now. It was almost funny, watching Walter try to maintain his dignity while shivering under 3 blankets, still trying to be the protector even though someone else was doing the protecting now. Jack understood that impulse, the need to be useful, to be strong, to never admit you might need help. He'd lived that way for 5 years, and look where it had gotten him. The fire chief, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who'd seen his share of emergencies, approached and crouched down beside Jack. Up close, Jack could see the name embroidered on his coat. Chief Maddox. You doing okay, son? Jack nodded, though he wasn't sure it was true. His hands were shaking. Not from cold now, but from adrenaline crash, and every muscle in his body ached. His knee was swollen, throbbing with each heartbeat, and his arms felt like they'd been stretched on a rack. You need medical attention too, Maddox said, not making it a question. Sarah, get over here. One of the paramedics, young, maybe 25, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, came over with her kit. Let me see your hands. Jack held them out reluctantly, and even he winced at what he saw. His fingers were red and blistered, the early stages of frostbite evident on 3 of them. His face probably looked worse. He could feel the tight burn of frozen skin across his cheeks and nose. You carried someone a 1/4 mile in that storm? Sarah asked as she began treating his hands, her touch gentle but efficient. Had to. Most people would have stayed in their vehicle. Called for help. No signal, Jack said. And they didn't have time. Sarah glanced over at Walter and Evelyn, then back at Jack, and something shifted in her expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition of what it had cost him to make that call. She worked in silence for a few minutes, applying salve to his hands, bandaging the worst of the damage. You military? She asked finally. Was. Navy. Thought so. She finished with his hands and moved to check his knee, which had swollen enough to strain against his jeans. You're going to need to ice this. Probably should get x-rays when we can transport people to the hospital. I'm fine. You're not fine, she said, echoing what he'd told Walter earlier. But you will be. She stood, patted his shoulder. What you did tonight, that was something special. Jack didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded and she moved away, back to her other patients. Rex, who'd been lying quietly beside Jack throughout the examination, shifted closer and rested his head on Jack's leg, the uninjured one. The dog's amber eyes looked up at him with something that felt like pride. You did good too, partner, Jack murmured, scratching behind Rex's ears. Across the room, Walter had finally submitted to the 4 and was now sitting with Evelyn's hand in his, watching the monitor that tracked her vitals. She was awake, talking softly to him, and even from this distance Jack could see the way they looked at each other. 47 years of marriage visible in a glance, in the way their fingers intertwined, in the small smile that played at the corners of Evelyn's mouth when Walter said something that made her laugh softly. Jack felt something twist in his chest, something that might have been envy or longing or just the recognition of what he'd lost when Sarah had left. He'd had that once. Someone who looked at him like he mattered, like his presence made the world better just by being in it. But he'd let the war and the guilt and the ghosts get in the way, had chosen numbness over connection. And now he sat alone against a firehouse wall with only a dog for company. Except that wasn't quite true, was it? Because Walter was looking over at him now, catching his eye, and the old man smiled. A real smile, warm and grateful and friendly. Like they were friends now, not just three people who'd survived something together. Like this meant something beyond the immediate crisis. Walter said something to a paramedic, then carefully stood, shakier than he probably wanted to admit, and made his way across the garage to where Jack sat. He moved slowly, one hand on walls and equipment for support. But he was determined, and Jack found himself straightening up, making room. "Mind if I sit?" Walter asked. "It's your floor too." Walter lowered himself down with a grunt, settling beside Jack with his own paper cup of coffee. For a moment they just sat there, two tired men drinking bad coffee, while the storm raged outside and strangers moved around them in the warm light. "I talked to the chief," Walter said finally. "He says we're stuck here till morning at least. Roads are impassable, power's out across the county, and even the plows can't get through this." "You worried about your family?" "They know we were coming. Sarah, our daughter. She'll be worried sick. But the phone lines are down, so there's no way to call her." Walter took a sip of coffee, made a face. "She's going to kill me when she finds out what happened. Tell her it was my fault. I'm the one who picked you up. She'll probably want to kiss you for that." Walter turned to look at Jack directly. "Jack, I need to say something, and I need you to listen without arguing." Jack tensed, recognizing the tone, serious, important, the voice of someone who'd thought carefully about what they were going to say. "You didn't just save our lives tonight," Walter continued. "You gave us our future back. The grandchildren we're going to watch grow up. The anniversaries we're going to celebrate. Every sunrise Evelyn and I get to see together from now on. That's because of you. I just drove."
No.
Walter's voice was firm. "Others drove past. We saw headlights, 3 or 4 sets, before you came along. They all kept going. You stopped, and then you carried my wife through a blizzard when most men half your age would have given up. You refused to leave me behind when it would have been easier, safer, smarter to do it. You got us here, and you did it because—" He paused, searching for words. "Because you're a good man. The kind of man who stops." Jack's throat was too tight to speak. He stared at his bandaged hands, remembering the weight of Evelyn in his arms, the way Walter had fallen and gotten back up, the moment his knee had given out and Marcus's voice had pushed him to stand. "Can I tell you something?" Walter asked, not waiting for an answer. "You remind me of my younger brother. He was Army Special Forces, came back from Desert Storm different than when he left. Spent 20 years thinking he'd failed because he couldn't save everyone, couldn't fix everything that was broken. Never let himself believe that saving anyone was enough." Jack looked up sharply. "What happened to him?" "Died 5 years ago. Heart attack." Walter's voice was soft with old grief. "Never got married. Never had kids. Spent his whole life alone because he couldn't forgive himself for things that weren't his fault." He turned to meet Jack's eyes. "Don't make his mistake, son. Don't let the ghosts win." Jack wanted to argue, wanted to say it wasn't that simple, that Walter didn't understand what it was like to lose someone because of a system that valued convenience over lives, to carry that weight every single day. But looking at this 73-year-old man who'd nearly died tonight, who'd gotten up after falling in the snow because Jack had told him to, who was sitting here now trying to save Jack the way Jack had saved him, he couldn't find the words to push him away. "I don't know how," Jack admitted finally, and it was the most honest thing he'd said to anyone in years. "You start by accepting that tonight mattered," Walter said. "That we matter. That you made a choice that changed everything for 2 people, and that's not nothing. That's everything." Before Jack could respond, the door to the firehouse burst open and a woman rushed in, snow swirling around her, panic written across her face. "Mom! Dad! Sarah!" Evelyn's voice, weak but joyful. The woman, mid-40s, auburn hair, Evelyn's eyes, ran across the garage, nearly slipping in her haste, and dropped to her knees beside her parents. She was crying and laughing at the same time, hugging them both, checking them over with the frantic hands of someone who'd been preparing for the worst. "I've been trying to find you for hours. The storm hit and you didn't show up and I couldn't call and I thought." She couldn't finish, just held them tighter. Jack watched the reunion from across the room, feeling like an intruder on something private and profound. But then Sarah looked up, her eyes scanning the garage, and Walter pointed in Jack's direction. Sarah stood and walked over, and Jack instinctively tried to get up, old manners, old training, but his knee protested and he made it halfway before she waved him back down. "Don't," she said, kneeling beside him instead. "You're Jack." He nodded. "You're the one who found them, who brought them here." "Yes, ma'am." And then she was hugging him, the stranger whose parents he'd pulled from a blizzard, and she was crying into his shoulder and saying, "Thank you," over and over, and Jack sat there frozen, not knowing what to do with this raw display of emotion, this gratitude that felt too big for what he'd done. When she finally pulled back, her mascara was running and her eyes were red, but she was smiling.
"I'm sorry."
"I'm a mess. When they didn't show up, I imagined every terrible thing. And then the roads closed and I couldn't even go look for them and—" She took a shaky breath. "You saved my parents. You gave them back to me." "I'm glad I was there," Jack said, and meant it. Sarah squeezed his hand, the one that wasn't too badly frostbitten, and then stood, composing herself. "Is there anything you need? Anything I can do?" "I'm fine." "He's not fine," Walter called from across the room. "He's got frostbite and a bad knee and he needs food and rest. But he won't admit it because he's stubborn." Sarah smiled despite her tears. "Sounds like someone else I know." She looked back at Jack. "There's a spare cot in the back office. Chief Maddox already said you can use it. And I'm going to bring you real food as soon as the road's clear. You hear me? Not firehouse coffee and vending machine snacks." Jack started to protest, but she was already walking away, back to her parents, and Walter was giving him a look that said, "Don't argue. Just accept it." Chief Maddox appeared again, this time with a clipboard. "Reeves, right? Jack Reeves." "Yes, sir. Need to get some information for the report." "Where are you from?" "Nowhere specific. I've been traveling." "Family we should notify?" Jack shook his head. "Work. Between jobs." Maddox studied him for a moment, and Jack had the uncomfortable feeling of being seen, really seen, in a way he hadn't been in years. "You saved 2 lives tonight," the chief said quietly. "Hell of a thing. Just did what needed doing. Most people don't." Maddox finished writing, then looked up again. "Storm's supposed to clear by morning. Roads should be passable by afternoon. You got somewhere to go." Jack thought about his truck, out of gas and buried in snow somewhere in the middle of town. Thought about the endless driving, the faceless motels, the years of movement without destination. "Not really." "Well, you've got somewhere for tonight at least." Maddox gestured toward the back office. "Get some rest. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Jack nodded his thanks and stood, slowly, favoring his good knee, with Rex immediately at his side. As he made his way toward the back office, he passed Walter and Evelyn and Sarah, still wrapped together, still crying and laughing and holding each other like they'd never let go. Evelyn looked up as he passed and reached out to touch his arm. "Thank you, Jack," she said softly, "for seeing us when we were invisible." Jack nodded, not trusting his voice, and continued to the office. It was small, cluttered with paperwork and equipment, but there was indeed a cot against one wall, and someone had left a pillow and blanket. He lowered himself onto it, every muscle screaming in protest, and Rex jumped up beside him, curling into the space against his chest. Jack lay there in the dim light, listening to the muffled sounds of people outside the door, the storm against the windows, the steady breathing of his dog. His hands hurt, his knee throbbed, his face felt like it was on fire from the frostbite treatment. But for the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel empty. He'd saved them, Walter and Evelyn Reed, 2 complete strangers who'd become something more in the space of a few terrible hours. He'd made the choice to stop, had fought through every obstacle, had refused to fail even when his body screamed at him to quit. And they were alive because of it. Marcus had been right. You didn't save the world. You saved what was in front of you. And maybe, in doing that, you started to save yourself. Jack woke to silence. The kind of profound, unsettling silence that only comes after a storm has finally exhausted itself. For a disoriented moment, he didn't know where he was. Then the ache in his knee reminded him, the throb in his frostbitten fingers, the warm weight of Rex pressed against his side. The fire station. Grayson, Walter and Evelyn. He sat up slowly, every muscle protesting, and looked at his watch. 6:30 in the morning. He'd slept maybe 4 hours, dreamless for once. His body too exhausted to summon the usual nightmares. Through the small window of the office, he could see pale light. Not the gray of storm clouds, but the clean brightness of sun on snow. The storm had passed. Jack stood, testing his knee, and found it stiff but manageable. He pulled on his boots, which someone had dried and left by the cot, and stepped out into the main garage. Most of the stranded people were still sleeping, curled up on cots or sleeping bags scattered across the floor. In the corner where he'd last seen them, Walter and Evelyn were awake, sitting close together and talking quietly. Walter looked up when Jack emerged, raised a hand in greeting. "Morning," Walter said softly, not wanting to wake the others. "How's the knee?" "Been worse." Jack made his way over, Rex padding beside him. "How are you both?" "Alive thanks to you," Evelyn said. She looked remarkably better. Color in her cheeks, clarity in her eyes, though she was still wrapped in blankets. "The paramedics say we can go home today. Sarah's coming to get us as soon as the roads are clear." "That's good news." Chief Maddox appeared from somewhere in the back, already in uniform, already working. "Reeves, you're up. Roads are starting to open. Power's back on in most of the town. You'll want to check on your vehicle." Jack had almost forgotten about the truck. "Where did I leave it?" "Corner of Main and 5th, according to our guys. They found it this morning during their rounds." Maddox handed him a coffee, real coffee this time, not the vending machine sludge from last night. "I can give you a ride over there if you want." 20 minutes later, Jack was standing in the middle of a transformed world. Grayson in daylight was nothing like the ghost town he'd driven through last night. The sun was brilliant on the fresh snow, turning everything into a postcard of small-town America. The street had been plowed, creating high white walls on either side, and people were already out, shoveling sidewalks, clearing cars, checking on neighbors. There was a sense of community here, of people who looked out for each other, that Jack hadn't experienced in a long time. His truck was where he'd left it, now just a blue hump in the snow. Maddox helped him dig it out, and Jack was surprised to find a jerry can of gasoline sitting in the truck bed. "Payment?" Maddox explained, "from the town's emergency fund for the service he'd provided." "You saved 2 of ours," the chief said simply. "Least we can do." Jack poured the gas into the tank, turned the key, and the engine caught immediately, reliable as always. He let it run, warming up, while Maddox gave him directions to the nearest gas station and then to Lou's Diner, where apparently everyone in Grayson eventually ended up for breakfast. "You should stop in," Maddox said. "Get some real food. On me." He handed Jack a $20 bill before Jack could protest. Not negotiable. The diner was a small place, probably built in the 50s and not updated much since. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floor, a long counter with round stools that spun, and it was packed. Every table full, every stool occupied, the air thick with the smell of bacon and coffee and the sound of a dozen conversations happening at once. Jack hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware of how out of place he was. A stranger in a town where everyone seemed to know everyone. But then the conversation started to die down, people turning to look at him, and Jack realized with growing discomfort that they knew who he was. "That's him," someone whispered, not quite quietly enough. "The one who saved the Reeds? Drove through the whole storm." A waitress appeared, maybe 50, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her name tag said Darlene, the same Darlene who'd refilled his coffee in Asheville yesterday. Except it wasn't the same woman, just the same name, the same tired kindness that waitresses seemed to universally possess. "You must be Jack," she said, smiling. Heard about what you did last night. Come on, honey. I've got a booth in the back. She led him through the diner, and people nodded at him as he passed, murmured thanks, a few even reaching out to pat his shoulder. Jack didn't know how to handle it, this public acknowledgement, so he just nodded back and kept walking, Rex close at his heels. The booth was in a quiet corner, and Jack slid in gratefully, Rex settling under the table. Darlene brought coffee without asking, then took his order: eggs, bacon, toast, the kind of breakfast he hadn't eaten in months. He was halfway through his first cup of coffee when a man approached the table, older, maybe 60, wearing a sheriff's jacket. Jack Reeves. Jack tensed instinctively. Yes, sir. Don Hutchins. I'm the county sheriff. He extended his hand, and Jack shook it. Mind if I sit for a minute? It's your town. Hutchins slid into the opposite side of the booth, took off his hat. I've been doing this job for 30 years, and in that time I've seen a lot of people do a lot of brave things. What you did last night, driving through that storm, getting the Reeds to safety, that's up there with the best of them. Let me finish, Hutchins said gently. Walter Reed is one of our own. Lived here his whole life, served in Vietnam, raised his kids here. When he and Evelyn didn't show up at their daughter's last night, half the town wanted to go out looking. We had to physically stop people from taking their trucks out into that storm. He leaned forward slightly. You did what we couldn't do, and for that, this town owes you a debt. No debt, Jack said. I'm just glad they're okay. Well, you might feel differently when people start showing up wanting to thank you. Hutchins smiled. Word spreads fast in small towns. By noon, everyone in the county will know your name. Jack's breakfast arrived, and Hutchins left him to eat in peace. But the sheriff had been right about word spreading. Over the next hour, a steady stream of people stopped by his booth. Friends of the Reeds, people who'd been in the fire station last night, the paramedic who'd treated his hands. Even a reporter from the local paper showed up, wanting to do an interview, but Jack politely declined. I don't have anything to say. But you saved 2 lives. They saved themselves by holding on. I just gave them a ride. The reporter left looking disappointed, but Jack didn't care. He wasn't interested in being a hero, wasn't interested in the attention. He'd done what needed to be done, and that was enough. He was finishing his second cup of coffee when the door opened and Walter walked in, followed by Evelyn and Sarah. They spotted him immediately, and the look on their faces, joy, gratitude, something deeper, made Jack's chest tighten. Sarah reached him first, already talking. Jack, we were hoping we'd find you. We're about to head home, but Mom and Dad wanted to see you before we left. Walter and Evelyn looked transformed from last night. Clean, rested, dressed in clothes that actually fit. Evelyn was steady on her feet now, though she kept one hand on Walter's arm, and there was color in both their faces that had nothing to do with medical intervention and everything to do with being alive. Jack? Evelyn said, and there was such warmth in her voice that Jack had to look away. We can't leave without saying goodbye. You don't need to thank me again, Jack said. You already did. This isn't about thanks, Walter said. He pulled something from his jacket pocket. A small package wrapped in newspaper and tied with string. This is about something more. He set it on the table in front of Jack, and when Jack didn't immediately reach for it, Evelyn gently pushed it toward him. Open it, please. Jack untied the string with clumsy fingers. The bandages made fine motor control difficult, and unwrapped the newspaper. Inside was a small wooden carving, maybe 3 inches long, of a truck driving through a snowstorm. The detail was remarkable. You could see the individual snowflakes, the way the truck's headlights cut through the darkness, even a tiny dog shape visible through the passenger window. Walter made it, Evelyn said softly. This morning, while we were waiting. He couldn't sleep, so he borrowed a knife from one of the firefighters and, well, he makes things when he needs to think. Jack turned the carving over in his hands, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the care that had gone into each cut. There was something about it, the solid reality of it, the way it captured what had happened, that made his throat tight. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Walter said. Just keep it. Remember that you made a difference. That you were there when it mattered. He reached across the table, placed his hand on Jack's. You gave us our tomorrow, Jack. Maybe you gave yourself one too. Sarah was crying again, wiping at her eyes. I wrote down our address and phone number. It's in the wrapping. She pulled out a business card, set it beside the carving. That's my cell. You call if you need anything. Anything at all. And you come visit us. We want to stay in touch. Jack looked at the card, at the carving, at these three people who'd somehow become important to him in the space of one terrible night. He'd spent 5 years keeping people at arm's length, convincing himself that connection was dangerous, that caring led to loss. But sitting here now, holding this gift that Walter had made with his own hands, Jack realized something. Isolation hadn't protected him from pain. It had just made him a different kind of dead. I will, he said, and meant it. I'll call. They said their goodbyes then, Evelyn hugging him carefully, mindful of his injuries. Walter shaking his hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong. Sarah kissing his cheek and whispering thank you one more time. Then they were gone, walking out into the bright morning, and Jack sat alone in his booth, holding the wooden truck, feeling the weight of what had happened beginning to settle into something he could carry. He paid his bill. Darlene refused at first, saying it was on the house, but Jack insisted, and walked back out to his truck. The town was fully awake now, people clearing snow, kids throwing snowballs, life returning to normal after the storm. Jack loaded Rex into the passenger seat, set the wooden carving carefully on the dashboard where he could see it, and sat there for a moment with the engine running. He could leave now, could point the truck in any direction and just drive, like he'd been doing for 5 years. Could add Grayson to the list of towns he'd passed through without leaving a mark, add Walter and Evelyn to the list of people he'd helped and then never seen again. But when he put the truck in gear, Jack realized something had changed. The urge to run, the compulsion that had kept him moving for half a decade, had quieted. It was still there, he could feel it, that restless need for motion, but it was no longer the only thing he felt. He thought about Marcus, about the promise he'd made 3 years ago to save something, to not let the world turn him cold. He'd been trying to fulfill that promise by driving, by moving, by staying numb. But maybe Marcus had meant something different. Maybe saving something meant saving the person right in front of you. And maybe, in doing that enough times, you eventually saved yourself. Jack touched the wooden truck on his dashboard, felt the smooth curves Walter had carved, and made a decision. He wouldn't run. Not today. Maybe not for a while. He'd stay in Grayson for a few days, get his truck properly serviced, let his body heal. And maybe, just maybe, he'd start figuring out what came next for Jack Reeves now that he'd finally stopped running from Jack Reeves. He pulled out onto Main Street, drove past the diner and the gas station and the little houses with their perfect snow-covered lawns, and for the first time in 5 years, the road ahead didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a possibility. 3 weeks later, Jack was somewhere in eastern Tennessee when his phone rang. He was parked at a rest stop outside Knoxville, Rex stretched out in the passenger seat, both of them taking a break from the road. Jack didn't get many calls, hadn't in years, so when the phone vibrated against the cup holder, he looked at it with something between curiosity and suspicion. A known number, local area code, but not one he recognized. He almost didn't answer. Old habits. But something made him reach for it, thumb hovering over the green button for just a moment before he pressed it. Hello, Jack. Oh, I'm so glad I reached you. Evelyn's voice, warm and familiar, flooded through the speaker. I wasn't sure if this was still your number. Jack sat up straighter, something tightening in his chest. Evelyn, is everything? Are you okay? We're fine, honey. Well, mostly fine. A pause, and Jack could hear her taking a breath. Walter had a little health scare last week. Nothing too serious, his heart just some irregular rhythms, but it put him in the hospital for a few days. Jack's grip on the phone tightened. Is he? He's home now. Doctor says he needs to take it easy, watch his diet, all the usual things they tell you when you're our age. She laughed, but there was a tremor in it. But he's okay, Jack. He's going to be okay. That's good. Jack realized he'd been holding his breath. I'm glad he's all right. The thing is, Evelyn continued, her voice softening. When we were at the hospital, waiting for test results and all that uncertainty, we kept talking about you, about that night, about how if you hadn't stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. We talk about you every day, Jack. Walter especially. You gave us more time, and we don't take a single moment of it for granted. Jack didn't know what to say to that. He looked out the windshield at the gray afternoon, cars passing on the interstate, people going about their lives without knowing how fragile it all was. I think about you both too, he said finally, and realized it was true. In the weeks since leaving Grayson, he'd caught himself wondering how they were doing, if Evelyn's strength had fully returned, if Walter was keeping warm enough. Small thoughts, but persistent. Jack, I'm calling because, well, we still owe you that dinner. Remember? The invitation still stands. More than stands, we really want you to come. There was something in her voice, a hopefulness that made Jack's throat tight. Would you? Would you come visit us? Jack looked at Rex, who'd lifted his head and was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes that always seemed to know more than a dog should. He thought about the address he'd saved in his phone, the one written on the back of Sarah's business card. He'd looked at it more than once over the past weeks, had even typed it into his GPS once before changing his mind and choosing a different route. When? He heard himself say. Whenever you can. This weekend? Next week? We're not going anywhere. Evelyn's joy was audible. Oh, Jack, that makes me so happy. Walter will be thrilled. They settled on the following Saturday, and after Evelyn gave him directions and made him promise he wouldn't back out, Jack ended the call and sat there in the cab of his truck, engine off, heater slowly fading, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Anticipation. Not the anxious kind, but something warmer. Something that felt almost like coming home. The week passed in a strange blur. Jack kept driving, old habit, couldn't quite break it, but he found himself taking shorter routes, stopping more often. He helped a stranded motorist change a tire outside of Bristol. He cleared snow from the driveway of an elderly woman in Abingdon who'd been trying to do it herself with a shovel too heavy for her frame. Small things, nothing heroic, just the kind of help that people needed and that he could provide. Each time he drove away, he thought about what Walter had said. You gave us our tomorrow. Maybe you gave yourself one too. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Jack had spent the night at a cheap motel just outside Grayson, and he woke early, nerves humming in a way that felt ridiculous. He'd faced enemy fire, had executed missions in hostile territory, had driven through a blizzard with 2 dying people in his truck. But the thought of sitting down to dinner with Walter and Evelyn and their family made his hands unsteady as he shaved in the motel bathroom mirror. You're being an idiot, he told his reflection. Rex, lying on the bed behind him, made a sound that might have been agreement. The Reed house was a small farmhouse about 10 minutes outside town, set back from the road with a long gravel driveway flanked by bare trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and there were cars already parked in front. Sarah's SUV, and 2 others Jack didn't recognize. Through the front windows he could see movement, shadows of people inside, the warm glow of lights against the winter afternoon. Jack parked his truck at the end of the line of vehicles and sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel. He could still leave, could text Evelyn with some excuse, could point the truck in any direction and just drive. She'd understand. Wouldn't she? But then the front door opened, and Walter was there, bundled in a flannel shirt and cardigan, his face breaking into a wide grin when he saw Jack's truck. He raised a hand, beckoning, and Jack realized there was no backing out now. He came. Walter's voice carried across the yard. Evelyn, he's here. Jack climbed out of the truck, Rex hopping down beside him, and Walter was already walking toward them with surprising speed for a man who'd just gotten out of the hospital. Jack. And Rex. I was hoping you'd bring him. He crouched down, grunting slightly at the effort, and let Rex sniff his hand before scratching behind the dog's ears. Good boy. You helped save us too, didn't you? Walter. Jack extended his hand, but Walter ignored it and pulled him into a hug instead. Quick, firm, the kind of embrace that said welcome home without needing words. When he stepped back, his eyes were bright. Come on inside. Everyone's dying to meet you. Everyone turned out to be more people than Jack had anticipated. Sarah was there with her husband Tom, who shook Jack's hand with genuine warmth. But there were also two more of Walter and Evelyn's children, a son named Michael and another daughter named Claire, along with their spouses and a small crowd of grandchildren ranging from teenagers down to a toddler who was currently attempting to climb the back of the couch. The living room was warm and chaotic in the best way, filled with the smell of something delicious cooking and the sound of multiple conversations happening at once. Evelyn emerged from the kitchen, apron on, and her face lit up when she saw Jack. "You're here." She wiped her hands on a dish towel and came straight to him, pulling him into a hug that was gentler than Walter's but no less heartfelt. When she pulled back, Jack could see tears in her eyes. "Thank you for coming. It means so much to us." "Thank you for inviting me," Jack said, and realized how inadequate the words were for what he was feeling. The next hour was a blur of introductions and small talk, children asking if they could pet Rex, yes, and if Rex could do tricks, a few, and adults thanking Jack in ways that ranged from brief and awkward to tearfully effusive. Michael, the son, looked Jack in the eye and said simply, "You gave me more time with my parents. I don't know how to repay that." Claire hugged him and whispered, "Thank you," and her voice broke on the words. Dinner was a loud, sprawling affair around a table that had clearly been extended with extra leaves to fit everyone. Jack found himself seated between Walter and Sarah, with Rex lying under the table at his feet, and the food kept coming. Pot roast and mashed potatoes and green beans and fresh bread and things Jack couldn't even name but tasted like love translated into sustenance. The conversation flowed around him, easy and familiar among people who knew each other's rhythms. Jack mostly listened, answering questions when they were directed at him but content to observe. There was something hypnotic about watching this family interact. The way Walter and Evelyn exchanged glances that spoke volumes. The way the grandchildren teased each other while the adults pretended to disapprove. The way everyone seemed genuinely happy to be together. This, Jack thought, is what I was protecting when I served. Not abstract concepts like freedom or democracy, though those mattered too, but this, families around tables, children laughing, people who loved each other getting to stay together. Halfway through the meal, Walter tapped his water glass with his fork, and the room gradually quieted. "I want to say something," he announced, and all eyes turned to him. He looked down the table at Jack. "A lot of you have heard the story of what happened that night. Some of the details, anyway. But I don't think I've properly explained what Jack did." "Dad, you don't have to," Sarah started, but Walter held up a hand. "I need to," he said gently. He turned back to Jack. "We were dying. That's not dramatic. It's just the truth. We'd made a stupid mistake, taken a wrong turn, and our car died in the middle of the worst storm I've seen in 40 years. We tried to walk, but we couldn't. The cold it was like being erased, like the world was slowly wiping us out of existence." Evelyn reached over and took his hand. The room was completely silent now, even the youngest grandchild sitting still. "Then we heard an engine," Walter continued, "and headlights appeared. I thought I was hallucinating at first, thought my brain was shutting down and giving me false hope. But then a truck stopped, and a man got out, and he said 3 words, 'Get in the truck.'" Walter's voice caught slightly. He didn't ask if we were okay, didn't waste time. He just knew and he acted. And then he drove us through hell, through conditions that should have been impossible, and he got us to safety. He carried Evelyn when she couldn't walk anymore. He refused to give up on us even when he stopped, composed himself. Even when it would have been easier to. Jack felt every eye in the room on him and wished he could disappear. "Jack," Walter said, "you didn't just save our lives. You gave our family their future. Every moment we've had since that night, every conversation, every hug, every ordinary beautiful moment, we have because of you. Our children still have their parents. Our grandchildren still have us." His voice broke completely now. "You gave us our tomorrow, son. All of our tomorrows." The room erupted in voices then. Thank yous and here's and some of the grandchildren asking questions all at once. Jack's face was hot, his throat tight, and he had no idea what to say. He settled for a simple nod, hoping it conveyed everything he couldn't put into words. After dinner, while the younger generation cleaned up and the grandchildren dispersed to various corners of the house to play, Walter led Jack to the back porch. Evelyn followed, carrying 3 mugs of coffee, and the 3 of them settled into rocking chairs that looked out over the snow-covered fields behind the house. For a long moment, they just sat in comfortable silence, sipping coffee and watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink. "So," Walter said eventually, "what have you been doing?" "Still just driving." "Mostly." Jack wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "Stopped in a few places. Helped some people here and there. Nothing major." "Still running," Evelyn said softly, not unkindly. Jack glanced at her, surprised by her directness. "I don't know what else to do." "Stay somewhere," Walter suggested. "Put down roots. Let yourself be still for a while." "I tried that once. Didn't work out." "Because you weren't ready then." Evelyn set her mug down and turned to face him. "Maybe you are now." Jack didn't answer. Wasn't sure he could. Walter cleared his throat. "Can I tell you something? About what happened after that night?" Jack nodded and Walter continued. "The town council had a meeting. Chief Maddox brought up what you did. How you drove through that storm when no one else could. How you saved us when we'd been given up for lost. And someone suggested that we needed a better system for situations like that. A formal program. They created something called the Stop and Help Initiative," Evelyn added. "Volunteers who are on call during severe weather. They check roads, help stranded motorists, distribute supplies to people who are stuck at home. They've already helped dozens of people this winter." Walter leaned forward. "They named it after what you did, Jack. You inspired a whole community to be better, to look out for each other. That's your legacy." Jack stared out at the darkening fields, trying to process that. He'd just been trying to get 2 people to safety. Had just done what needed to be done. The idea that it had sparked something larger, that other people were now actively choosing to help because he'd made one choice on one night, was almost overwhelming. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said quietly. "I didn't do it to inspire anyone." "We know," Evelyn said. "That's exactly why it matters." They sat in silence for a while longer, and then, without quite meaning to, Jack started talking. About Marcus. About the ambush and the explosion and the blood on his hands that he could never quite wash away. About the guilt that had hollowed him out, the belief that he'd failed, the years of driving because staying still meant thinking and thinking meant drowning. "I almost kept driving that night," he admitted, the words coming out raw. "When I saw you standing there, my first instinct was to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen you, because getting involved meant risking failure, and I'd already failed the person who mattered most." "But you stopped," Walter said. "I heard Marcus's voice in my head. He used to say, 'Don't let this place make you cold.' I never knew what he meant until that moment. He meant don't stop seeing people. Don't stop caring. Don't let the trauma win." Evelyn reached over and took Jack's hand. The same hand that had carried her through the snow, that had kept her alive. "You think you failed him, but maybe saving us was how you honored him. Maybe he knew you weren't cold, even when you thought you were." Jack felt tears on his face and didn't bother to wipe them away. Rex, who'd been lying at his feet, raised his head and pressed against Jack's leg, offering the only comfort he knew how to give. "I miss him," Jack said, and it was the first time he'd said it out loud to anyone. "I know you do, honey." Evelyn squeezed his hand. "But he'd be so proud of you, of who you are, of what you did for us." They sat together as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear. 3 people bound together by one impossible night, and Jack felt something inside him shift. Not heal, not yet, maybe not ever completely, but shift. Open. Let in a small amount of light. When he finally left, hours later, the family gathered on the porch to see him off. The grandchildren waved, the adults hugged him, and Walter walked him to his truck. "You'll come back?" Walter asked. Jack looked at the house, glowing warm in the darkness, at the family visible through the windows. "Yeah," he said. "I'll come back." "Good." Walter clapped him on the shoulder. "You're part of this family now, whether you like it or not." Jack drove away with Walter and Evelyn's address saved in his phone under a new contact name. Family. The wooden carving sat on his dashboard where it always did now. A reminder that he'd been there when it mattered. That he'd stopped when he could have kept driving. That one choice had created ripples he was only beginning to understand. The road stretched out ahead of him, dark and empty. But for the first time in 5 years, Jack wasn't running from anything. He was just moving forward, 1 mile at a time, toward whatever came next. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. 1 year later, almost to the day, Jack found himself driving through another snowstorm. But everything was different now. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks earlier. A cream-colored card with elegant script. Storm Survivors Dinner. You're the guest of honor. Below that, in Walter's distinctive handwriting, "Please come, Jack. It wouldn't be right without you." Jack had kept the card on his dashboard next to the wooden carving, reading it every time he climbed into the truck. Guest of honor. The word still made him uncomfortable, but he'd learned something over the past year. Sometimes accepting gratitude was a gift you gave to other people, not yourself. The snow was falling lighter this time, nothing like that night. Jack drove with Rex beside him, the radio playing low, and he realized he wasn't tense. A year ago, storms meant adrenaline and hypervigilance and memories he couldn't escape. Now they just meant weather. Drive carefully. Help if needed. Get where you're going. He'd spent the year in motion, but purposefully now. He'd volunteered with storm response teams in 3 different counties, had trained a dozen people in emergency protocols, had helped set up supply distribution networks for isolated communities. Walter had been right about the ripple effect. One choice, stopping for 2 strangers in a blizzard, had somehow expanded into a mission that filled his days and quieted the ghosts. Not that the ghosts were gone. Marcus still visited him, especially in the quiet moments before sleep. But the visits felt different now. Less like hauntings and more like reminders of who Jack wanted to be. The community center in Grayson was lit up like a beacon when Jack pulled into the parking lot. Cars lined the street, and through the large windows he could see people moving around inside. More people than he'd expected. His stomach tightened. This was going to be bigger than he'd imagined. Rex pressed his nose against Jack's arm, sensing the tension. "I know, buddy," Jack muttered. "But we promised." He grabbed the bottle of wine he'd brought, the one thing he knew how to contribute to dinners, and headed for the door. The warmth hit him first when he stepped inside. Then the noise, conversations and laughter and the clink of dishes, and then the faces. So many faces, all turning toward him. And for a moment Jack's instinct was to turn around and leave. But then Walter was there, moving through the crowd with his arms outstretched. "Jack! He's here!" Walter pulled him into a bear hug that still surprised Jack with its strength. At 74, with a year of healthy living behind him, Walter looked better than he had that night. Color in his cheeks, steadiness in his movements. "Come in, come in. Everyone's been waiting." Evelyn appeared next to her husband, and she looked radiant. Her gray hair was styled, her smile wide, and when she hugged Jack she whispered, "Thank you for coming. This means everything." Then the crowd descended. Jack recognized some faces, Sarah and Tom, Michael and Claire, the fire chief, the mechanic who'd fixed his truck. But there were others he didn't know. A family approached first, the father extending his hand. "Mr. Reeves?
I'm David Chen.
You helped us last February when our car died on Route 14. Got us to safety. Refused to take any payment." He gestured to his wife and 2 small children. "We wouldn't have made it without you." Jack shook his hand, overwhelmed. "I remember. Glad you're all okay." More people came forward. An elderly man Jack had driven to the hospital when his wife had a heart attack. A woman whose roof he'd helped repair after a tree fell on it. A teenager whose car he'd pulled out of a ditch. Each one with a story, each one wanting to thank him, and Jack felt something building in his chest that he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief, or the dawning understanding that what he'd been doing all year, the small acts of help, the stopping when others drove past, had mattered to more people than he'd realized. Dinner was loud and chaotic and wonderful. Jack found himself seated at the head table with Walter and Evelyn, their extended family spreading out at the tables nearby. The food was abundant, pot roast and chicken and casseroles and pies, and the conversation flowed easily. People shared storm stories, laughed about close calls, talked about the changes in their town's emergency preparedness. The Stop and Help initiative has assisted 63 people this year, the fire chief announced at one point, raising his glass. 63 people who might have been in serious trouble if someone hadn't stopped to check on them. That's because of what Jack started. Jack shifted uncomfortably. I didn't start anything. You stopped, Evelyn said gently, placing her hand on his. That's what started it. After dessert, Walter stood and tapped his glass with a spoon. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning toward him. Jack felt his throat tighten. A year ago tonight, Walter began, his voice strong and clear. My wife and I made a mistake, one wrong turn on an unfamiliar road, and suddenly we were lost in the worst blizzard this region had seen in decades. He paused, looking at Evelyn, who squeezed his hand. We thought our story was over. We'd survived wars and raised children and built a life together. But we thought it was going to end on that frozen highway, alone and forgotten. The room was completely silent now. Then headlights appeared, and a man we'd never met, who didn't know us and didn't owe us anything, made a choice. He stopped. Walter's voice broke slightly. He got out of his truck in the middle of a killer storm, and he said 3 words that saved our lives. Get in the truck. Jack stared at his plate, unable to look up. Jack Reeves didn't just drive us to safety. He carried my wife when she couldn't walk. He refused to leave me behind when I told him to. He drove through conditions that should have been impossible and got us to help when we had minutes left. Walter turned to look directly at Jack. He gave us our future back. Every moment we've had this year, every sunrise, every family dinner, every ordinary beautiful day, we have because he stopped. The applause started then, building into something overwhelming. Jack's face burned, and he finally looked up to see Walter still watching him with tears on his cheeks. When the applause died down, Evelyn stood. She was smaller than Walter, but her presence filled the room. Jack taught us something important, she said. Heroism isn't about grand gestures or dramatic rescues, though what he did was certainly dramatic. Scattered laughter. It's about seeing people who are invisible. It's about stopping when you could keep driving. It's about saying, I can help, when it would be so much easier to say, not my problem. She looked around the room. How many of you have stopped to help someone this year because of what Jack did? How many of you have chosen to see instead of looking away? Hands went up around the room. Most of them, almost all of them. That's his real legacy, Evelyn said. Not saving 2 old people from a storm. Inspiring a community to care for each other. The fire chief stood next, holding a plaque. Jack, we know you don't like attention, but this community wants to recognize you officially. He read from the plaque, Honorary Volunteer of the Year, for exemplary service and dedication to helping others. Jack stood because it seemed like he was supposed to, accepted the plaque because refusing would have been rude, and looked at the roomful of faces. All of them smiling, some of them crying, all of them looking at him like he was someone worth celebrating. I don't deserve this, he said, his voice rougher than intended. I'm just a guy with a truck who happened to be in the right place. That's exactly why you deserve it, Walter called out, and there was laughter and applause. Jack looked down at the plaque, then out at the faces. He saw Walter and Evelyn healthy and whole. He saw the people he'd helped living their lives. He saw the fire chief and the volunteers who joined the initiative. And something shifted inside him, the last piece of weight he'd been carrying finally lifting. A friend of mine, Jack said slowly. His name was Marcus Reed. He died 3 years ago in an ambush overseas, and for a long time I thought I'd failed him. Thought I hadn't done enough, hadn't been fast enough, hadn't been good enough. His voice steadied. Marcus used to tell me, don't let this world make you cold. I never understood what he meant until the night I found Walter and Evelyn. He looked at them. He didn't mean don't be cruel. He meant don't stop seeing people. Don't stop caring. Don't let the trauma win. Jack paused, gathering himself. I'd been driving for years, past people who needed help, because I was so afraid of failing again. I was cold. Not because I was cruel, but because I was hurt. The room was absolutely silent. Walter and Evelyn didn't just let me save them, Jack said. They let me save myself. They reminded me that one person helping one other person matters. That you don't have to save the world. You just have to save what's in front of you. He looked at Marcus's ghost. Not literally, but in his mind, and thought, I finally understand, brother. I'm not cold anymore. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and thank yous and promises to stay in touch. Near the end, Walter pulled Jack aside to a quiet corner. I have something to tell you, Walter said. The town council voted last week. They want to make the Stop and Help initiative permanent. Full funding, official status, the works. He paused. And they want you to run it. Jack stared at him. I'm not from here. You are now. Walter smiled. Think about it. A real salary, a place to stay, a purpose. You could stop driving and start living. Jack thought about it, about staying in one place, about building something permanent, about being part of a community instead of just passing through. A year ago, the idea would have terrified him. Now it felt like a possibility. I'll think about it, Jack said. Evelyn appeared, looping her arm through Walter's. That's not a no. Jack smiled, something he did easily now. It's not. He left the dinner late, Rex sleepy in the passenger seat, the wooden carving and the plaque side by side on the dashboard. The snow had stopped, leaving the world clean and quiet. Jack drove slowly through town, past the diner where he'd had breakfast that first morning, past the fire station where they'd found shelter, past all the places that had somehow become familiar over the past year. On the edge of town, he saw hazard lights flashing on the shoulder. A car pulled over, hood up. Jack's first instinct, ingrained now, was to check. He pulled over behind the car and climbed out. A young woman stood by the open hood, phone in hand, looking frustrated. She jumped when Jack approached, then relaxed when she saw Rex. Car trouble? Jack asked. Won't start. I think it's the battery, but I'm not sure. I've been trying to call a tow truck, but there's no signal out here. Jack looked at the engine, confirmed it was the battery, and grabbed his jumper cables from the truck. 10 minutes later, her car was running, and she was thanking him profusely. You're a lifesaver. Can I pay you something? No need. Jack closed her hood. Just help someone else when you get the chance. She drove away with a wave, and Jack stood there in the gently falling snow, feeling the symmetry of it. 1 year ago, he'd stopped for Walter and Evelyn. Tonight, he'd stopped for a stranger. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because it was who he'd become. He climbed back into his truck, Rex shifting to rest his head on Jack's leg, and sat there for a moment in the quiet. The road stretched out ahead, lit by his headlights, full of possibility. He could take the job in Grayson, put down roots, build something permanent. Or he could keep driving, keep helping, keep moving. Either way, he wasn't running anymore. Either way, he wasn't cold. Jack reached over and touched the wooden carving, Walter's gift, his reminder, and then pulled back onto the road. Not running from anything, not searching for redemption, just moving forward, ready to stop whenever someone needed him. Because sometimes survival isn't about strength. It's about someone who stops. Someone who sees you when you're invisible. Someone who says, when the world is howling and cold, get in the truck. And maybe, if you're lucky, someone who teaches you that saving one person, just one, can save you too.